I never liked the forest at night. Not really. During the day, it feels alive in a gentle way, sunlight filtering through the leaves, birds calling, the smell of damp earth warming in the sun. At night, it's different. At night, the forest feels like it's breathing around you, patient, aware, and watching. Tonight, I was alone. My truck was parked at the ranger station, its engine still warm from my drive in. The lights were dim, the fluorescent bulbs flickering just enough to make the shadows twitch along the walls. I knew I would be the only one patrolling this stretch of wilderness tonight. Midweek, midnight shift, perfectly empty, perfectly silent. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, swung the heavy door closed behind me, and started down the path that led into the forest. My boots crunched against the gravel in a slow rhythm. I told myself it was just me, my thoughts, my imagination. But even as I repeated it, the hair on my arms stood up, and my eyes darted to the dark shapes between the trees. Something about the way the moon caught the tips of the pine needles made the shadows stretch longer than they should, twisting across the ground like black ink spreading over paper. The forest smelled different at night, too. Cold, damp, with that metallic tang that reminds you of rain, even when it hasn't rained in days. I breathed it in deeply, trying to anchor myself in the normal things. The smell of pine, the smell of earth, the cold bite of wind on my cheeks. The trail was quiet, and I moved slowly, deliberately, checking the usual spots where hikers sometimes wandered off the path. The old lost hiker signs, the ones faded nearly to illegibility, seemed more threatening in the moonlight. I'd seen enough cases over the years to know what happened when someone got lost. At first it was just sounds, small ones. A branch snapping far to my left, I stopped, listened, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. My flashlight cut a cone of pale light into the darkness. Nothing. I shook my head. My radio crackled faintly and I murmured a soft copy into the mic even though no one was really listening. It was a habit, a reassurance. I could hear my own voice, low and steady, reminding myself that I was still here, still human, still awake. The path curved and I passed a small creek. Water trickled over rocks, soft and constant, almost hypnotic. I paused, knelt, and let my hand trail in the icy flow. The cold shocked me and I realized my pulse had jumped. That was the first real moment where the forest felt deliberate, like it was waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to become aware of its presence. I took a deep breath, stood, and moved on. I told myself it was just my mind, nerves fraying after years of these night patrols. But then came the sounds that weren't so small. Footsteps. Far off, maybe 100 meters ahead, soft, almost careful on the undergrowth. My gut clenched, I froze. Every instinct in me told me to call it in, to speak into my radio and tell someone I was hearing something. But I stayed silent. Maybe it was a hiker, or maybe I didn't want to finish that thought. I flicked my flashlight ahead, sweeping the beam slowly. The trees were black pillars, the undergrowth a dark tangle. Nothing. Not a movement, not a shape. I moved forward slowly, boots crunching louder than usual, careful not to make too much noise. And that was when I felt it, the sensation of being watched. Not just the usual forest observation, not the way eyes might catch you if you turn your head. This was different. It was everywhere, all around me. Something in the forest was aware of me. It was patient, not hurried, but deliberate. And in that awareness, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I kept walking. I told myself stories to calm down. The footsteps were probably another ranger or an animal. The watching, well, that was my imagination. The forest had always been this way at night, quiet, unyielding. But tonight the air seemed heavier, each shadow deeper than the last, and the silence too complete. I rounded a bend and saw the first sign of human intrusion in a long while. A faded trail marker, old and leaning. Someone had carved initials into the bark. A date, too, long past. It made me think of all the people who had passed through here, some careful, some careless, and some who had never left. My stomach tightened. I had seen the markers of disappearances before, shallow graves hidden under fallen leaves, notes carved into trees that no one would ever see. The forest remembered, I realized, in ways we could never truly understand. The beam of my flashlight caught something moving in the corner of my eye, a shadow quick and gone before I could focus on it. I stopped, swallowed hard, and waited. My breath sounded loud in my own ears. The forest was still, too still. Only the creek murmured in the distance, and somewhere far off, a branch snapped again. I shook my head and started walking again. Every step felt heavier, as though the forest itself was pressing down, slowing me, testing my patience. I told myself to breathe, slowly, in, out, slowly. My hand brushed the butt of my flashlight. Its weight was reassuring. The sound of my boots against the path became a heartbeat, a rhythm. I could keep this rhythm, keep myself safe, just keep moving. I came to a clearing. Moonlight spilled over a patch of grass, silver and cold. I paused, letting my eyes adjust. Something was off. The clearing wasn't empty. A log had been rolled over, branches moved aside. It was subtle, but enough to make my skin crawl. It looked like someone or something had been here recently. I knelt, examining the ground. Small footprints, too small to be a man. Maybe a woman, maybe a child. Or maybe I didn't want to know. The tracks led into the trees on the far side of the clearing. I followed them slowly, careful, heart hammering. The deeper I went, the darker it became, until the light from the moon was filtered through the thick canopy, pale and dappled, making shapes where none should be. The tracks ended suddenly near a pile of rocks. A marker, maybe, or a warning, I couldn't tell. But my gut told me this wasn't random. Something was here. Something was aware of me. I stopped, took a deep breath, listened. Nothing but the creek, the wind in the trees, the soft rustle of leaves, and then just faintly a whisper. Or maybe it was the wind shaping itself into words my mind wanted to hear. I froze, every nerve taut. I strained to listen. There it was again, a soft syllable, too deliberate to be random. I shook my head violently, telling myself it was imagination. I told myself I was a ranger. I knew this forest. I could handle this. But deep down, I knew that some part of this place didn't like being known, didn't like being observed. Some part of the forest thrived on patience, waiting until the right moment to remind you that you were only ever a visitor here. I continued down the trail, each step slow, deliberate. My flashlight beam swung in small circles, catching shapes that seemed almost human, almost animal, but never quite there. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was tired, that it was the shift, the darkness, the isolation. And maybe it was all of that. But maybe, just maybe, there was something else waiting for me in the shadows. And I just knew that the forest was patient. It was watching, waiting, and I was walking right into it. I kept moving, though every step felt heavier than the last. The forest seemed to fold in on itself, narrowing the path, thickening the shadows. My flashlight traced thin lines across the undergrowth, but the darkness always seemed just beyond the beam, waiting. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunch of leaves behind me. I froze. The sound was faint, subtle, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Not animal, not wind through the branches. Human. I held my breath, straining my ears. The forest seemed to lean closer, pressing in, listening alongside me. I told myself to stay calm. My pulse thumped in my ears, loud, insistent. Maybe it was another ranger or someone else doing a night hike. But something about the timing, the rhythm, made my stomach tight. The steps didn't hurry. They weren't panicked, not yet. They matched mine, or were they following me? I paused, slowly turning in a full circle. Nothing, just the trees, black and silent. I exhaled, trying to release the tension coiling in my shoulders. I whispered into the radio, a soft, all clear so far, though I knew no one was listening. Habit, reassurance. I started walking again, careful, deliberate. My boots sank slightly into damp leaves, the sound crisp in the quiet night. And then I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps following the exact pattern of my own. I stopped abruptly, held my breath. My flashlight wavered in my hand. I told myself to stay rational. There's always a rational explanation. Maybe a deer stepping on twigs. Maybe another hiker turning around. I tried to focus on the path ahead, on the thin line of light cutting through the darkness. I tried to remember why I took this shift alone, why I insisted on patrolling when everyone else had the week off. I liked the solitude, the quiet. It was supposed to be peaceful, safe. But the footsteps didn't belong to peace. They belonged to something else. Something patient, moving deliberately in time with me, waiting for a moment when I would slip, when I would glance back and see it clearly. My heart hammered, loud enough that I feared it would echo through the trees. I kept walking slowly, hoping that my own rhythm might confuse it, that it might pass me by. I thought about the missing hikers from last year, a group of 3 college students. They had taken this very trail, nightfall approaching, and never returned. Search parties had combed these woods for days. They found nothing, no traces of struggle, no bodies, nothing. The forest had swallowed them whole, leaving only rumors and unanswered questions. I had driven past their campsite once, months later. Empty tents, the smell of decayed food, trampled undergrowth. The kind of place that feels wrong even in daylight. And now, with the crunching of leaves behind me, I couldn't help but imagine them walking just ahead, ghosts of memory and misfortune. Were they still here? Or had something else replaced them? My mind wove scenarios, each darker than the last, and I forced myself to exhale slowly, grounding in the weight of my boots against the trail, the grip of the flashlight in my hand. I came to a small ridge overlooking a creek. Water gurgled quietly over rocks, and for a moment I allowed myself to focus on the soothing sound. My reflection shimmered in the creek, pale and distorted, eyes wide, lips pressed thin. I knelt, tracing my fingers through the icy water. The sensation was grounding, human. For a brief moment, I almost believed the footsteps had been my imagination. Almost. Almost, but not quite. The steps came again, closer this time, matching my pace with eerie precision. I dared not look back. My breath became shallow, uneven. Every instinct screamed at me to turn, to run, to call out. But I stayed still, telling myself that movement could provoke it. Silence was my shield. I whispered under my breath, trying to anchor myself. It's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing. The mantra didn't work. It never does. I moved on, forcing each step, feeling the forest breathe around me. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. Every so often, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A fleeting movement, a sway that shouldn't be there, a shadow that didn't belong to any branch or tree. I couldn't tell if it was real or my mind fracturing under the tension of solitude. I remembered my first night shift, fresh out of training, eager, confident. A small animal had darted across the path and I had jumped, heart racing. The veteran ranger beside me had laughed softly, shaking his head. "You get used to it," he said, "or you get eaten alive by your own imagination." I had smiled politely, but I remembered thinking deep down that some part of me would never get used to it, that the forest had a patience that no training could overcome, that the forest waited always. Now I understood what he meant. I rounded another bend and came to a deadfall, a tangle of fallen branches blocking the narrow trail. I stepped over it carefully, eyes scanning every shadow, flashlight beam flickering slightly as I adjusted my grip. That's when I saw the first sign. A footprint, fresh, soft, pressed into the damp soil beside the path, small. Not my size, not a boot, barefoot, human. My pulse quickened. I dropped to my knees, examining it. It led forward into the undergrowth. I traced it with a finger, the soil cold and sticky. Whoever had made it, or whatever, was ahead of me, watching, moving. I felt the forest close in, compressing the space between me and the unknown. I stood, breathing slowly, reminding myself I was trained for this. I could handle it. Rangers deal with lost hikers, aggressive animals, storms, even the occasional criminal who thinks the woods are a safe place to hide. But this felt different. This was not natural, not logical. It was deliberate, waiting, observing. I moved forward again, carefully, boots pressing into the wet leaves. The sound of my own steps seemed loud, echoing through the trees. And then faintly the steps behind me. Quieter now, hesitant, as though it was testing me, gauging my reaction. I wanted to stop, to wait, to listen. But curiosity, or maybe foolish courage, propelled me forward. The forest whispered around me, leaves brushing together, wind shifting in soft sighs. I imagined the missing hikers, imagining them just ahead, leading me deeper. The thought was both horrifying and compelling. I had to see. I had to understand. That's the curse of people like me. curiosity paired with responsibility. I am paid to patrol, to observe, to protect. But sometimes observation alone is not enough. The trail narrowed. Trees leaned inward, branches clawing at the night sky. Moonlight barely touched the forest floor, leaving dark pools where shadows could hide. The steps behind me had stopped. Silence. Complete suffocating silence. And in that silence I felt the weight of eyes on me. Not human eyes, perhaps, or perhaps the memory of human eyes that had never left this place. Watching, judging, waiting. I stopped, listened, held my breath, tried to remind myself that all of this was the forest, nothing more. A dense, quiet, patient forest. Nothing malicious, nothing conscious. But even as I thought it, I knew it was wrong. Wrong in the way the footprints led forward, wrong in the way the air felt thicker, wrong in the way the silence had substance. I exhaled slowly, deliberately, and forced my feet to move. The trail continued, winding deeper into the forest, into darkness. And though the footsteps had stopped, I could feel them, still patient, as if the forest itself was following, keeping time with my heart, marking me, nodding me, remembering me. And in that knowledge, I realized the truth of it. The forest never forgets. The forest remembers the lost, the careless, the curious. And tonight I had become one of them, at least in its eyes. The forest had swallowed the path behind me, leaving only a narrow ribbon of trail under the pale moonlight. My boots pressed into the wet leaves with a sound that seemed too loud for such a quiet night. I kept my flashlight raised, scanning each tree, each shadow. I thought about the footprints, the footsteps, the lost hikers I had imagined, and I told myself to breathe. Slowly. In, out, slowly. The cold air filled my lungs, grounding me in the moment, reminding me I was still here. And then I saw it. A cabin, leaning slightly to one side, weathered by years of neglect, half hidden behind a stand of pines. Its wooden walls were cracked, paint peeling, the roof sagging in places. A single window, dark and empty, stared at me like an eye. I had walked this trail many times before, but I didn't remember seeing this cabin. Perhaps it was new. Perhaps it had always been there, waiting, patient, unnoticed until now. I approached cautiously, flashlight sweeping over the exterior. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as it moved in the night wind. I paused, feeling a chill creep down my spine. I told myself that cabins like this one often sat abandoned, relics of old ranger stations or hunting shacks, nothing more. But the instinct I had learned over years in these woods told me to be careful. There was a weight to this place, a presence. I stepped onto the small porch, the boards groaning under my weight. My hand lingered on the door frame. The wood was rough, splintered, colder than the night air. I pushed gently and the door swung open with a soft squeal. Inside, dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, suspended in the stale, cold air. The smell hit me first, mold, decay, and something faintly metallic. Blood, perhaps. Old blood, long dried, barely noticeable unless you knew the smell. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. The room was small, cluttered with the remnants of someone's life long abandoned. A broken chair lay on its side, papers scattered across the floor, a rusted tin stove in the corner. My flashlight landed on a table and my stomach sank. Notes. Handwritten notes pinned haphazardly to the wall, some yellowed with age. Words scratched across the paper in a frantic hand. Names, dates, warnings. Don't follow, one read. They watch. Another, never alone, never trust the shadows. I felt my pulse quicken. The handwriting was old, jagged, desperate. Whoever had written these notes had lived here, or had been trapped here. And whatever they feared enough to leave a record, hoping someone would read it, hoping someone would understand. I moved closer, reading each one carefully, letting the words sink in. The notes referenced hikers, missing persons, strange occurrences, all within this forest, all connected. A chill ran down my spine. I realized that I was reading the echoes of others' fear. Their paranoia had been real, their dread palpable. And now I was here, alone, tracing the same steps they had taken, following the same path into the unknown. I explored further. A narrow hallway led to a back room. The floorboards creaked under my weight, a soft symphony of sound that seemed to echo too loudly in the still night. I swept my flashlight across the room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with more papers, journals, photographs. Most of the photos were faded, black and white, showing people I didn't recognize, hikers, families, lone travelers. Some faces were smiling, others strained, tense, as though aware of something unseen behind the camera. I picked up one photo. A young woman, her eyes wide, a smile frozen halfway. Something in her gaze unsettled me. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand. I put the photo down carefully, almost reverently, as if touching it might summon whatever had been watching her. On the wall opposite the door, more notes. This time they were larger, scrawled directly on the wooden planks. They take what they want. Never follow the sound. The forest remembers. The words seemed almost ritualistic, repeated in patterns. My stomach twisted. I felt a connection, a thread between the fear recorded here and the forest outside. The whispers in the trees, the footsteps that had followed me, it all aligned. I moved to a corner of the room where the papers were piled highest. One notebook lay open, its pages yellowed and brittle. I leaned closer, careful not to disturb it too much. The handwriting inside was frantic at first, becoming more deliberate as the entries progressed. A ranger, it seemed, had lived here, alone, documenting strange disappearances, noises in the woods, shadows that didn't belong. Names were mentioned, locations, dates. The more I read, the heavier the air became, as though the forest itself was aware of my intrusion. I set the notebook down and turned to leave, but something stopped me. My flashlight caught a movement in the corner of my eye. Shadows flickered against the walls, though the wind outside was still. I spun slowly, beam cutting across the room, and nothing. Just the cabin, silent, waiting. I exhaled slowly, trying to ground myself. Maybe fatigue was distorting my senses. Maybe the forest was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind. The cabin felt alive. Not with a human presence, not with warmth, but with history, with memory, with the weight of all who had feared these woods and disappeared within them. Each note, each photograph, each scrawled warning was a piece of a puzzle I didn't yet fully understand. And now I was part of it. I noticed the fireplace, cold and empty, ashes long gone. Above it, more notes pinned and layered. One message stood out. If you see them, do not look directly. Do not respond. Move slowly, stay calm, never alone. I shivered. The advice was simple but precise, born of terror and experience. Whoever had written it had survived, at least long enough to leave it behind. A small cupboard in the corner creaked as I opened it. Inside were jars, dirt, rocks, strange little tokens I couldn't identify. Some smelled faintly of smoke. Some were lined with markings, scratches, almost like tally marks, counting something, someone. I closed the cupboard slowly, careful not to disturb more than necessary. Every sound seemed magnified, every movement a signal. The cabin wasn't just abandoned. It was aware of my presence in some subtle, unmeasurable way. I moved back toward the door, notebook in hand. My mind was racing, piecing together the fragments. The missing hikers, the notes, the footsteps in the forest, the footprints I had seen earlier, the trail that seemed to shift under my boots. It all connected here in this cabin, recorded in desperate handwriting and faded photographs. Someone had been here. Someone had feared the forest and documented it. And maybe they hadn't left entirely. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. I felt it brush against the cabin, carrying the scent of moss and earth. My pulse slowed slightly, the weight of my discoveries pressing on me. I wanted to stay, to examine everything, to understand every note and every photo. But some part of me knew that staying too long would be dangerous. The forest would notice. It would remember me, and it was patient. I stepped onto the porch again, letting the night air fill my lungs. The cabin loomed behind me, dark and silent, yet alive with memory. I glanced back once more. The door swayed gently in the breeze. The shadows inside seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, as if the cabin itself was breathing. I felt the footsteps again, not behind me, but in my mind. A memory of someone, something, following, watching, waiting. I took a deep breath and started back down the trail. The forest seemed quieter now, or maybe my awareness had sharpened, attuned to every subtle sound. The notes in the cabin, the photographs, the warnings, they were all a map of fear, a guide through the darkness. I repeated the words under my breath as I walked. Stay calm, move slowly, never alone. Words I didn't fully understand, but words I intended to obey. And as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin would not be the last reminder I encountered tonight. That the forest had more to show me, more to reveal, patient, watching, and I was only beginning to understand its silence, its memory, its intent. I thought leaving the cabin would be simple. I had followed the trail in, and logically the trail should lead me back out. But the forest had other plans. As I stepped onto the narrow path, flashlight beam cutting a swath through the darkness, I noticed something subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The trail seemed different. The markers I had passed on the way in were gone. The familiar bends and ridges that I remembered from previous patrols had shifted. Trees leaned in odd directions, their shadows stretching in ways that defied the moonlight. My stomach twisted. I blinked, shook my head, and tried to reassure myself. Fatigue. Night vision playing tricks. I told myself that the forest couldn't change overnight. That logic still applied here. But it felt wrong. Every step I took seemed to deepen the darkness around me. The trail narrowed, leaves brushing against my arms as though reaching for me. The air had grown heavier, more oppressive. I could hear the creak in the distance, but it sounded different somehow, farther than it should have been. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind, a natural distortion of sound at night, but the feeling of being watched refused to fade. I stopped and listened. Nothing moved, at least nothing I could see, but the sensation of eyes on me was undeniable. Somewhere, hidden in the dark, something observed me. Patient. Silent. I couldn't pinpoint it, couldn't catch it in my flashlight beam. It was everywhere at once, surrounding me, pressing in on my mind as much as my body. I took a slow step forward, then another. The forest seemed to respond, shadows stretching toward me, narrowing the path, guiding me in directions I didn't remember taking. The ground shifted subtly beneath my boots, fallen leaves crunching louder than before. The trail seemed to elongate, curve back on itself. I tried to convince myself to stay calm, breathing slowly, counting. In 2, 3, out 2, 3, slowly, deliberately. And then I saw it, a faint movement between two trees. My heart jumped. I swung the flashlight beam and the shape vanished. No sound, no trace, just a shifting shadow that should not have been there. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, anything rational, but it moved with intent, like it was aware of me, keeping pace without making a sound. I picked up my pace. The forest seemed to shift again, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The trees I had passed moments ago now loomed closer, branches snagging my jacket, the path narrowing to a width that shouldn't exist. I stumbled, caught myself on a low branch. My flashlight flickered. I cursed it under my breath, shaking the device, but it steadied again. I forced my legs to move, telling myself the forest couldn't trap me. It couldn't. Memories of last year's missing hikers flooded me. I had studied the search reports, looked at photographs, walked the trails where they disappeared. They had been found, eventually, in some cases, but only partially broken, displaced, their paths impossible to trace. The forest had swallowed them, or something within it had. And now, walking the same woods alone, I understood the creeping sense of inevitability that had haunted their final hours. I heard the faintest sound behind me, a snap of twigs, too light for footsteps but deliberate. I stopped, frozen. My flashlight scanned slowly, carefully, but there was nothing. Just the forest, dense, patient, observing. My breath came in shallow, rapid bursts. I reminded myself I was trained, experienced. I had handled emergencies, injuries, lost hikers. I could handle this. Logic, reason, anchors. But the logic felt fragile, brittle, slipping under the weight of the forest's silence. I moved again, slower this time, careful not to disturb more than the necessary leaves underfoot. Every step echoed too loudly. Every shadow seemed alive. I remembered the advice scrawled in the cabin. Stay calm, move slowly, never alone. I whispered it under my breath, letting the words guide me. But I was alone, and yet the forest suggested otherwise. Another shift. The trail split where none should have been. My mind traced the path I thought I knew, but both directions seemed wrong. The markers, the small carvings, the rocks stacked as signs, were gone. Only unfamiliar shapes, unrecognizable branches and undergrowth and shadows that clung closer than they should. The air pressed down harder, damp with cold. I tried to remember why I chose this job, why I loved the woods in the daylight. Calm, predictable, safe. I reminded myself of those mornings, the soft sunlight breaking through the pines, the quiet of dawn, the fresh smell of earth and pine needles. I clung to that memory, repeating it like a mantra. But the forest at night ignored mantras. At night, it had its own rules, its own patience, its own awareness. I took a deep breath and turned again, following what I hoped was the trail. And then I felt it more strongly than ever. The eyes. Not one pair, but many. In the branches, in the shadows, in the spaces between trees, they didn't blink. They didn't move. They simply observed. I couldn't locate them, couldn't name them, but they were there. Always. Watching. Waiting. Patient. I whispered aloud, softly, "I'm leaving, just let me go." My voice sounded strange in the dense night air. Too loud, too fragile. I received no answer. And yet I knew the eyes had heard. They had been tracking me the entire way. The footsteps I had imagined or thought I had heard were nothing compared to this presence. I pressed on, heart hammering, boots slipping slightly on wet leaves. The trail shifted again. A turn that I didn't remember, a slope that seemed steeper than before, the creek now audible but in a different direction. I tried to orient myself, tried to focus on landmarks I had passed earlier. Nothing matched. The forest had folded itself around me, reshaped, and I was the intruder in its new geometry. Memories surfaced again, the reports, the photographs, the missing hikers. I imagined them here somewhere, trapped, wandering in the folds of the trail that shifted without warning. Alone, waiting. I could almost hear their whispers in the wind, faint and indistinct, half-formed voices carried over the rustle of leaves. My pulse raced, but I reminded myself to breathe. Slowly, deliberately. In, out, in, out. And then a shape moved across the trail ahead. Quick, almost too fast to register. My flashlight flicked toward it and it was gone. No sound, no trace, only the forest, dense, patient, watching. I felt a hand, phantom or imagined, brush against my shoulder. I froze, mind screaming, body locked. Nothing, only leaves and cold air. My imagination, I told myself. Fear playing tricks, the forest waiting, always waiting. I began to run, carefully. Slow at first, then a little faster. The trail twisted again, curving in ways that should not have existed. My flashlight caught glimpses of shapes in the corner of my vision, figures, shadows, or maybe memories pressed into the forest. My breath was loud, shallow, echoing unnaturally. I stumbled over roots, nearly fell, caught myself against a tree. And then abruptly the trail ended. Not a bend, not a fork, but nothing. Just thick undergrowth, trees closing in, shadows pooling like ink. I scanned with my flashlight, heart racing. Nothing moved, nothing shifted. And yet the sensation of being observed had intensified, pressing against my chest, my mind, my very sense of self. I realized then that the forest had changed completely. I could not retrace my steps. The path I thought I knew no longer existed. I was somewhere else entirely. Alone, surrounded, watched, patiently. I whispered again, low and trembling, "I just want out." My voice carried, swallowed by the forest. And in the silence that followed, I understood a terrifying truth. The forest did not simply surround you. It remembered you. It observed you. It waited. And I had become part of its memory. I had been hiking all day, following the winding trails that cut through the dense forest. The sun dipped low behind the mountains, and the warmth of late afternoon gave way to the cool bite of night. I had always loved the woods, the way they felt alive yet silent, how the wind carried the faint smell of earth and pine. But that evening, something about the shadows seemed different. I had been so focused on keeping pace that I didn't notice the trail splitting. One path curved sharply to the left, disappearing into thick underbrush. I hesitated, flashlight in hand, listening to the forest settle around me. Birds had long gone silent. Even the rustle of squirrels and small animals had faded. Only my own breathing filled the quiet. The left trail looked promising, familiar enough that I convinced myself it was still part of the main path. I stepped forward, boots crunching softly against dry leaves. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The trees thickened, their gnarled roots twisting over the path like ancient hands trying to stop me. My flashlight cut a narrow circle of light, illuminating the immediate ground, but everything beyond vanished into blackness. I felt a strange tightness in my chest, a pressure I couldn't name. The forest seemed quieter than normal, almost expectant. That's when I heard it. A whisper, soft, almost inaudible, carried on the breeze. I froze, heart hammering. "Hello," my voice sounded small, insignificant against the enormity of the night. Nothing answered, but the whispering continued, faint and insistent. Words I couldn't make out, syllables sliding into each other like a language just beyond understanding. I swung my flashlight slowly, scanning the dark trunks, but the forest remained still. No movement, no shadows, only the trees, silent and patient. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was the wind, but the sound had direction. It came from just beyond the next ridge, weaving between the trees, shifting with me as I moved. My pulse quickened. I considered turning back, retracing my steps to the main trail. But a part of me, stubborn and foolish, wanted to know, wanted to see what or who was making those sounds. I walked forward slowly, each step deliberate. The whispering seemed to retreat when I advanced, keeping its distance, teasing me. Leaves crunched underfoot, the sound startlingly loud in the oppressive quiet. My flashlight flickered once, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw movement. A shadow slipping between the trunks, too quick to focus on, too deliberate to be a trick of the light. I swallowed hard and pressed on. The air had grown colder, carrying the damp scent of moss and fallen leaves. My breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the stillness. I felt my skin prickling, as if tiny fingers brushed across my arms and neck. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, to call for help. But there was no one here. No one would hear me. Only the whispers, curling and twisting between the trees just out of reach. I stopped, dropped my backpack to my knees, and listened. The whispering grew slightly louder, rhythmic, almost like voices in conversation. I strained, trying to discern words. There were syllables I recognized, fragments. "Don't follow alone, leave." The fragments didn't form a sentence, but the meaning was clear. The warning was directed at me. My heart thumped harder. I wanted to call out, to say I was just passing, that I meant no harm, but my voice caught in my throat. Fear was tightening like a cord around my chest. I forced myself to stand and continued walking. Every so often, the ground shifted beneath my boots, roots tripping me, uneven stones nudging my balance. My flashlight scanned the forest floor and the low branches. Every shadow seemed too dark, every tree too close. I remembered the stories hikers tell each other, the ones who vanish, whose friends claim they walked into the night and never returned. I had always thought they were exaggerations, campfire tales to scare beginners. But now, each step, each whisper, felt like those stories were warning me from the past. The path twisted unexpectedly. I had no memory of it bending this way. The forest around me seemed to have thickened further, closing in. I felt the shadows pressing toward me, the whispers rising slightly as if anticipating my next move. My flashlight flickered again. I cursed it under my breath, gripping it tighter. I couldn't stop now. I didn't want to stop, and yet a part of me screamed to turn back. I thought about the ranger station I had passed earlier, how easily I could head back, seek help, find safety. But the forest had other plans. It had shifted. The familiar ridge where I had hoped to see the main trail was gone, replaced with twisted roots, low-hanging branches, and an unfamiliar slope leading further into darkness. My stomach churned. Panic, slow and insidious, began to creep in. The whispers grew again, closer this time. I could hear fragments of words, now sharper, more distinct. "Alone, alone, don't follow." It was as if the forest itself were speaking through some hidden mouth, shaping the night air into a warning. My pulse raced, my hands trembled slightly. I told myself it was just echoes, tricks of wind and leaves. I repeated it like a mantra, just echoes, just echoes, just echoes. But the forest was not empty. I felt eyes on me. Not human eyes perhaps, but something aware, watching, waiting, patient. The sensation crawled along my skin, up my arms, across the back of my neck. I quickened my pace, boots scuffing against the leaves, but the whispers moved with me, always just beyond the edge of comprehension. I thought about my family sitting at home, unaware that I had wandered so far. The thought of them calmed me slightly, grounding me. I whispered their names under my breath, repeating them, holding onto them. Slowly, deliberately, I tried to regain control. Breathe. In, out, in, out. Step by step, I moved forward. Then through the beam of my flashlight, I noticed movement again. This time it was clearer, a fleeting glimpse of someone or something between two trees. I froze, my chest tight. The figure didn't approach, didn't move with urgency. It merely watched, half hidden in shadow. And then it was gone. Nothing remained. Only the oppressive darkness and the whispers. I began to run, cautiously, desperately. The forest seemed to fold around me, the trees rearranging themselves, branches snagging at my clothing, roots trying to unbalance me. Every step I took felt longer, heavier. My heart thumped violently. The whispers were louder now, fragmented phrases rushing in waves. Leave, alone, leave now. My flashlight flickered one final time. The shadows around me deepened. The forest seemed infinite, impossible to map, impossible to leave. And yet I moved, compelled by instinct, by fear, by the desperate need to find the path back to safety. I stumbled over a root, fell hard onto the ground. Pain shot through my leg, but I forced myself up. The whispers surged briefly, a crescendo of warning that made my skin crawl. I kept moving, ignoring the ache, ignoring the fear that threatened to consume me entirely. Hours or maybe minutes passed. Time seemed meaningless in the forest. The whispers became a constant hum in the back of my mind, an ever-present reminder of my solitude. I realized that the forest had not just trapped me physically, but mentally, threading its patient, unseen presence through my thoughts, embedding fear like roots through soil. And yet somewhere deep inside, a stubborn thread of reason remained. I would leave. I would find the trail. I would survive. The forest could whisper, it could shift, it could watch, but it could not claim me. Not yet. I pressed forward, step by careful step, into the darkness, into the night, alone. I kept moving, though every step felt heavier than the last. The forest had swallowed the trail completely, folding shadows over themselves, and the whispers had not stopped. They were faint now, almost imperceptible, like the memory of sound rather than sound itself, brushing against the edges of my mind. I could not tell if they were real or imagined, but I did not stop. I could not stop. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin. A clearing appeared, dimly lit by slivers of moonlight cutting through the canopy. At first, it seemed like a relief, a place to catch my breath, to gather my thoughts. But as I stepped forward, the air changed. It grew colder, heavier, carrying a damp, metallic scent that set my stomach churning. The whispers had faded, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. The clearing was small, circular, and eerily uniform. The grass had been flattened, as if many feet had passed this way, yet I saw no footprints. At the center lay a shallow depression in the earth, partially hidden under a thin layer of leaves. I crouched, flashlight trembling in my hand, and peered closer. The soil was freshly turned, dark and loose, and embedded in it were fragments of what looked like old, rusted metal. My pulse quickened. Rusted tools, bits of wood, and the remnants of what could have been containers, jars, maybe boxes, half buried and broken. I realized with a cold, sinking certainty that this was not random. Someone had buried these here deliberately, evidence, or perhaps something worse. My mind immediately jumped to the missing hikers I had read about last year, the bodies never found, the theories that never fully explained where they went. Could this be one of their sites? I forced myself to breathe. Calm, step by step. I knelt, letting the beam of my flashlight sweep across the pit. Symbols carved into the surrounding trees caught my attention. Simple, crude, yet unnervingly deliberate, lines and spirals, concentric circles and crosses. They formed a pattern around the clearing, a protective or ritualistic perimeter. My throat went dry. Something about the shapes was familiar in a way I could not place, yet they made my skin crawl. I felt watched. even more so than before. The trees surrounding the clearing seemed taller, closer, as if leaning inward, focusing on me. I tried to rationalize it. Low moonlight, shadows playing tricks, the mind exaggerating fear. But logic felt distant, fragile. I had stepped into something deliberate, something human yet inhuman in its implications. As I examined the pit, my flashlight caught on something unexpected, a fragment of cloth. Dirty, torn, faded, but unmistakably fabric from a jacket, possibly a hiker's. My stomach twisted. The weight of realization settled over me. These objects were not just old debris. They were remnants of people who had disappeared. Whispers of lives abruptly ended, traces left behind for someone or something to find. I stood slowly, trying to take in the full clearing. The forest around me was still. No wind, no rustling, only the faint hum of distant insects. Yet the air was thick, almost palpable, as if the shadows themselves had mass. I felt it pressing at the back of my neck, at the sides of my face, like the forest was aware I had discovered its secret. My hands shook, gripping the flashlight tighter, but I could not look away. The symbols carved into the surrounding trees drew me in, irrationally compelling me to trace them with my fingers. They were rough, gouged with some sharp implement, edges still splintered. Each symbol seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight, a subtle rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. I could almost hear it, like the clearing had a voice, and it was whispering directly into my thoughts. Don't leave. Stay. Watch. Wait. I shook my head violently, trying to break free of the sensation. Focus. Think. I was a hiker, an observer, nothing more. And yet the pit, the symbols, the fragments of human life, they were all evidence of something I could not comprehend fully. It wasn't just a crime scene. It was a warning, or a trap. I crouched again, shining the flashlight into the pit. The soil shifted slightly under my hands, and I noticed faint impressions in the earth. Footprints, small, human, but irregular, as if someone had stumbled, dragged, or been pulled. I swallowed hard, a dry, trembling sound. My mind reeled. These could not be recent, could they? And yet the earth had not completely settled over them. Someone or something maintained this place. I could feel it. I stepped back, shaking, trying to collect my thoughts. The forest seemed to exhale around me, a soft sigh carried on a breeze that had no source. The whispers returned, faint, teasing, as if confirming what I already feared. You are here. You see what we left behind. You cannot leave untouched. I tried to step toward the edge of the clearing to leave, but my legs felt leaden. The forest had folded around me, enclosing, guiding. I felt the shadows at the perimeter, pressing in, not with weight but with awareness. I could not see it, could not name it, but I knew it was there. Watching, judging, waiting. Memories came unbidden. Missing hikers, their faces in the photographs, their gear abandoned, the trails they had followed. I had studied the reports, memorized the maps. I had never imagined I would stand here, staring at a tangible reminder of their fate. The pit, the cloth, the symbols, they were all pieces of a puzzle I could not solve, a story whose ending I could not guess. I whispered to myself, trying to cling to reality. I am alone. I am safe. I am leaving. My voice sounded weak, even to me, swallowed immediately by the night. The clearing remained still, silent in response. The shadows did not recede, the air did not light. The forest had claimed this hollow. And then I saw it, a faint shape near the edge of the clearing, a figure crouched low, partially hidden behind a tree. My flashlight wavered in my trembling hand. The figure did not move, did not speak, but I felt its gaze, intent, patient, waiting. I blinked and it was gone. Nothing remained. Only the pit, the symbols, and the oppressive weight of the forest. I tried to rationalize it. Animal, shadow, trick of the light. But my instincts screamed differently. The forest had revealed one of its secrets, and it had made me aware I was trespassing. I stepped back slowly, careful not to disturb anything else, careful not to attract attention. The whispers intensified subtly, almost encouraging me, but in a tone that made my skin crawl. Move, leave, or stay. The meaning was unclear, but the intent was unmistakable. I did not want to test it. I did not want to linger. Yet I could not tear my eyes away from the pit. the cloth, the symbols carved into the surrounding trees. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to turn. Each step away from the clearing was measured, deliberate. I did not look back. The forest seemed to shift subtly as I moved, shadows bending, branches brushing at my shoulders, almost guiding me along a path I did not recognize. I realized then that this forest was not a place of random trails and chance. It was ordered by someone or something that cared deeply for its secrets. I did not stop running, though I could hear the faint echo of whispers following me, carried in the wind, brushing against my mind. I did not dare look back, even as the clearing faded behind the trees. The hollow, the symbols, the pit, and the fragments of the past remained behind me, but not entirely. Their presence lingered in the shadows, in the weight of the night, in the pressure that made each step forward feel like wading through thick water. I finally reached a narrow trail, one I recognized, leading deeper into the forest but familiar enough that I could follow it. My breathing slowed slightly, though my heart still pounded. The whispers faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the forest at night. Yet I knew they had not gone. They were waiting, patient, for the next hiker to stumble upon their hollow, their secret. I pressed forward, flashlight cutting through the dense darkness, the hollow behind me etched into memory, a warning I could not ignore. I thought I knew the way back. At first it seemed simple enough. Just follow the ridge I had descended, trace my steps through the trees, return to the trail I had abandoned. My flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness, and I leaned on it as if it were a lifeline. But almost immediately, the forest betrayed me. The footprints I had left behind, my own, fresh, crisp in the dirt, were gone. The soil was disturbed as before, but the clear marks of my boots had vanished. The leaves lay as if untouched. Every step I tried to retrace dissolved into an ambiguous smear of shadow and earth. I blinked in disbelief, kneeling to examine the ground more closely. Nothing. The path I had followed only minutes ago was no longer there. A chill ran down my spine. I had read about people becoming disoriented in the forest at night, stories of hikers wandering in circles, lost for hours, even days. I had laughed at them before, thinking it absurd. Now I understood too well. The forest did not forget. It erased. It reshaped. And it was patient. I forced myself to breathe slowly, calm, step by step, focus. I tried to recall landmarks, the way the trees leaned, the small rock that jutted from the slope, a fallen log that had formed a natural bridge over the roots. But even those markers seemed wrong, moved slightly from where I remembered, distorted by some subtle hand that warped space without warning. My pulse quickened. The shadows deepened, stretching and twisting in ways that felt unnatural. I could feel them pooling along the edges of my vision, and when I blinked, I thought I saw them shift, just a fraction, as if adjusting to my movements. I swallowed, tasting copper on my tongue. The whispers returned, softer this time, almost intimate, threading through the empty spaces between the trees. You are here. You are lost. You are watched. I tried to speak, to say something aloud, to remind myself that I was human, alive, real. I'm just trying to find my way back. My voice trembled. It sounded absurdly small, swallowed immediately by the heavy forest air. No response came, but I could feel the pressure of attention, unseen eyes tracking each movement, patient, waiting. I took another step forward. The leaves underfoot were soft, almost muffled, and I realized the sounds I expected. The crunch of dry leaves, the snap of twigs were absent. My presence made no impression on the forest. It was as though the world had decided I did not belong. My footsteps faded, swallowed into nothing. Panic crept in. Not the sudden, screaming panic that makes your limbs shake violently, but a slow, suffocating dread that fills your chest and throat. My mind flickered to memories of missing hikers, the search parties that found nothing, the rumors of forest spirits, of things that lived in the shadows between trees, waiting for those who strayed too far. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that rational thought still existed here, that I was not hallucinating. But reason felt fragile, a thin shell pressed against the weight of night. I kept moving, forcing my feet to follow a path I could not see. Every tree seemed unfamiliar, yet familiar simultaneously. Branches snagged at my jacket, roots tried to trip me, but the forest did not punish me outright. It merely guided me in circles, folding space around me so that each step forward led me back to the same hollow, the same pit I had discovered earlier. I stopped, gasping, heart hammering. The clearing lay before me, the faint outline of the symbols around it now distorted, almost as if they had shifted overnight. The pit remained dark and silent, but the fragments I had seen, the cloth, the rusted metal, were gone. The earth looked undisturbed, freshly leveled, hiding its secrets once more. I bent closer, trembling, but the evidence had vanished, leaving only soil and shadow. I realized then that the forest was not just erasing paths, it was erasing memory. The longer I stood there, the more uncertain I became of what I had seen, of what I had touched. Had the clearing been real? The pit? The fragments of human life? My mind faltered. I remembered the whispers, their urgency, their warning, but even their voice felt like a fading echo. I moved again, this time with no aim but forward, hoping that some instinct would guide me. The shadows thickened around me, pulling inward. Shapes formed briefly in the moonlight. Tree trunks bent unnaturally, roots twisted into shapes that resembled limbs, leaves fluttering as if they were breathing. Every step made the world feel less solid, as if I were walking through a dream that had grown darker, more insistent. I thought about leaving the forest entirely, breaking through the trees to open ground, to safety. But the terrain had changed. Slopes were steeper, ridges unfamiliar. I had no sense of direction. My compass, small, pocket-sized, wavered, the needle spinning briefly before settling in a way that felt wrong. North, south, east, west, none of it mattered here. The forest did not respond to maps or logic. It responded to presence. And I was present utterly and completely. I paused again, leaning against a tree, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I remembered the sound of rushing water earlier, a small stream I had crossed, the way the rocks had felt beneath my boots. I decided to try to find it again, thinking that water would lead me to a recognizable path. I moved cautiously, scanning the ground and listening for the faintest trickle. But the sound did not come. Instead, the whispers returned, curling around me in soft, unintelligible syllables. Their tone was teasing now, patient, almost amused. I felt a sudden, inexplicable vertigo, the sensation that the clearing, the pit, the hollow, they had never existed at all. Or perhaps they existed elsewhere, in a layer of the forest I had stumbled into by accident. My mind was fraying at the edges, and with each step, I felt the world become less tangible, less predictable. Footprints vanished before I could see them. Shadows shifted in impossible ways, and the night pressed closer, thicker, almost liquid in its density. I slowed, breath shallow, hand gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The forest seemed to hum softly, the sound vibrating through the roots beneath my boots. I wondered if this was punishment or a test. If the forest had memory, it remembered those who had trespassed and erased them, not with malice, but with the cold inevitability of nature reclaiming its own. My thoughts drifted, unbidden, to those missing hikers again. I saw their faces in fleeting glimpses, remembered the photographs I had studied. I imagined them here in the shadows, their presence lingering as part of the forest's memory. The pit, the symbols, they were a story, a warning left behind for anyone who wandered too far. And now I understood, in the slow, creeping way that dread takes hold. I was part of that story now. My footsteps had been recorded and erased and observed. I forced myself to move again, step by careful step, each one deliberate. The darkness around me thickened, the shadows pooling into shapes that seemed to mirror my fear. I could feel unseen eyes at the edges of my vision, patient, watching, waiting. The whispers faded, leaving only a cold, oppressive silence, punctuated by the soft sighing of the wind through the trees. I stumbled onto a small ridge, trying to orient myself, and saw a faint glimmer ahead, moonlight reflecting off water. Relief washed over me. Perhaps it was a stream or a pond I had crossed earlier. I moved toward it, careful not to slip, careful not to attract attention. And then I realized the water was not where it should be. The stream I had memorized, the sound I had trusted, the path I had counted on, it had disappeared, replaced by more shadows, more impossible twists of the forest. I stopped, swallowed hard, and whispered to myself, trying to anchor my mind, "This is a forest. It is real. I am alive. My footsteps may fade, my path may vanish, but I am here, and I will find my way." I did not know if the forest would allow me to leave. I did not know if I could trust my senses, my memory, my instinct. I only knew that the clearing, the pit, the hollow, and the erased footprints had marked me in a way that I could not undo. The night had claimed part of me, threading unease and uncertainty through my very perception. And so, step by slow, deliberate step, I pressed forward into shadows, into uncertainty, hopping to find the faintest trace of a path, hopping that somewhere ahead the forest might relent and allow me to leave its memory intact. The first time I saw the campground, I nearly drove past it. The forest's edge had swallowed the road in darkness, and the signs warning of abandoned areas were bent and faded. My headlights caught a faint gleam, a strip of metal catching the moonlight. I slowed, squinting, and realized I was staring at the old entrance gates, rusting quietly, half collapsed, swinging slightly with the wind, the hinges groaning like a tired voice. I parked my car on the shoulder, the gravel crunching under my tires, loud in the otherwise complete silence. I stepped out, pulling my jacket tighter against the night air. It was colder than I expected, and the scent of damp earth mixed with pine needles filled my lungs. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease pressing against my chest. This place had been abandoned for years, ever since the reports, the missing hikers, campers who never returned, the search parties that had found nothing. The gate loomed ahead, crooked and weathered, the paint long gone, leaving the metal bare and orange with rust. I reached out and brushed my fingers over the cool surface. It wobbled slightly, protesting, but held. Beyond the gate, the path into the campground was overgrown, twisted with roots and weeds that had claimed the asphalt. The wooden signs, once cheerful, painted with the campground name, were broken and unreadable. I took a step inside, and the air seemed to shift immediately. The forest pressed closer, branches leaning in as if to watch. Leaves rustled softly, though there was no breeze. I told myself it was the trees settling, the night alive with small movements, but it didn't feel natural. I felt like I had crossed into a different world, one that had not been touched by time in the way I expected. I wandered along the old road, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam across the campsites. Tents had long since rotted, poles leaning at impossible angles. Picnic tables were overturned, splintered wood sticking out at odd angles. The remnants of campfires lay cold and gray, surrounded by rocks that looked more like teeth than markers of human leisure. Somewhere deep in the shadows, I thought I heard the faint crunch of leaves underfoot. I froze, holding my breath, listening. Nothing, just the soft sigh of the trees and the distant hum of insects. My chest tightened. I thought of the missing campers. Where had they gone? Who had taken them? The questions had no answers, only the lingering echo of absence. I moved toward what had once been the main lodge. The building was barely standing, walls caved in, windows shattered, the roof sagging. Graffiti covered the remaining surfaces, strange symbols scrawled in black paint. I knelt to examine one of the marks. It was a circle, with lines radiating inward and outward, crude but deliberate. My pulse quickened. I had seen similar symbols in old news photos of the missing persons investigation. Was this part of it? Or had someone returned to leave their own marks in the ruins? The wind shifted, brushing my face, carrying a soft whisper that seemed almost human. I paused, straining to hear. It was gone the moment I tried to focus, like a secret the forest didn't want shared. I swallowed, the air suddenly heavy in my lungs. I realized I was alone, or at least I should have been. But the feeling of eyes on me, lingering just beyond the flashlight's reach, was undeniable. I walked further past the abandoned cabins. The doors hung open, creaking softly, their interiors dark and hollow. I thought of the stories, the campers who vanished without a trace, their gear left behind, their laughter replaced by silence. I forced myself to focus on the present, to step lightly, to stay aware. but the forest seemed alive, breathing, and aware of me. At the edge of the campground, I found what had once been a small playground. Rusted swings swayed slightly, though there was no wind, chains squealing softly. A seesaw leaned precariously to one side. I imagined children playing here long ago, their voices echoing faintly in the night. The thought twisted in my stomach. Were any of those voices ever truly gone? Or had they lingered somehow, waiting for someone to notice? I kept moving, flashlight beam cutting through the dark, stepping carefully around roots and fallen debris. The path curved into a grove of trees, denser here, and the air grew colder. I felt the forest close in, pressing at the edges of my awareness. I thought of the search parties from years past, combing this area tirelessly, finding nothing but the echoes of what had happened. And now, walking here alone, I understood why. The forest had a way of erasing itself, of hiding the evidence, of making the past impossible to grasp fully. I paused near what had once been a small creek. Water still ran here, barely visible in the moonlight, soft and slow. The banks were overgrown, tangled with roots and reeds. I leaned over, watching the reflection of the trees ripple in the water. Something moved just beneath the surface, a shadow indistinct, slipping away before I could focus on it. I frowned, heart tightening. My mind wanted to dismiss it, to rationalize it. But deep down, I knew the forest had tricks. It had patience. It had memory. And it had no interest in being understood by strangers. I continued along the old path, the camp long abandoned but still alive with its own history. I saw remnants of tents, small toys, broken lanterns, and scattered cans of food. Each object seemed to hum with the weight of what had happened here. The missing campers, the quiet searches, the unanswered questions, they were all part of this place now, and I was intruding. The trees thickened, shadows pooling along the edges of my vision. I felt that weight again, the sense of being observed. I stopped, listening. For a long moment there was nothing but the soft creak of wood and the distant hum of insects. And then just for an instant I thought I heard a whisper, low, almost lost in the night, but unmistakable. Go, it seemed to say. Or maybe it was just the wind, I could not tell. I shook my head and moved on. The campground stretched before me, silent, broken, and waiting. I realized then that I was standing on the threshold of something I could not leave behind, a memory carved into the earth, a history that refused to fade. Every step I took felt heavier, weighted with the knowledge that I was not meant to be here. At last I reached the far edge of the campground, where the trees formed a thick barrier. Beyond them lay the forest proper, dense and dark, its interior unknown and unwelcoming. I hesitated, looking back at the rusted gates, the hollow cabins, the collapsed lodge, the playground swaying in the night. I could almost see traces of the past, the laughter, the voices, the footsteps that had vanished into nothing. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm the tightness in my chest. The campground was quiet now, but the memory of it lingered, pressing into my mind. I knew I could not stay long, not tonight, not ever. And yet, a small part of me felt that the forest would not let me leave so easily. I took one last look, tracing the outlines of the ruins, the rusting gates, the shadows pooling between the trees. The air was still heavy, the night thick with unspoken stories. I stepped forward, back toward the edge of the forest, back toward the road, but I knew the image of this place. The abandoned campground, the traces of missing lives, the whispering shadows, would not leave me. Not for a long time. The gates creaked softly behind me as I left, rusted quietly, holding the secrets of a forest that never truly forgets. I thought I had left the worst of it behind, the rusting gates, the broken cabins, the hollow playground. But as I stepped deeper into the campground, the night seemed to grow heavier, thicker, like a curtain pressing down. The shadows moved differently now, longer, curling around the bases of trees and the edges of the broken asphalt. The moon, thin and pale, barely touched the ground. Every step I took was muffled by the dead leaves underfoot, yet the forest seemed to listen, waiting. Then I heard it. At first I couldn't believe it. A faint sound, almost lost in the rustle of the wind through the trees, yet unmistakable. The soft, high-pitched laughter of children. A single giggle, then another, delicate and fleeting. I froze, straining to locate the source. The campground was empty. The cabins were abandoned, the tents rotted away. No one should have been here. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice shaking slightly. The sound of my own words seemed too loud in the stillness. No reply, only another soft laugh, distant and teasing, as if circling me just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was a trick of the mind, the wind teasing my ears, yet the sound was too distinct, too deliberate. I moved slowly, carefully, toward the origin of the laughter. It seemed to come from the playground where the swing swayed gently, chains squeaking in the still air. The slide was broken, its edges jagged and gray, but the giggling seemed to ripple around it, filling the empty space with echoes of past joy. I swallowed, feeling my throat dry. These were not memories I had personally witnessed, yet they felt familiar, as if the forest itself had stored them in the air, replaying them for anyone foolish enough to listen. I approached the swings. The laughter grew slightly louder, though still distant, like children teasing from behind a wall. I saw nothing. Nothing moved except the old swings, swaying slightly as if nudged by unseen hands. I bent closer to examine the ground. No footprints, no signs of recent visitors, just the same leaves and dirt that had been here for years. And yet the sound persisted, a soft chorus that made the night feel impossibly alive. I took a step back. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the wind passing through the broken structures, the hollow spaces amplifying sounds, creating a semblance of laughter. Perhaps my imagination, already frayed by the weight of this abandoned place, was inventing it. But even as I reasoned, the laughter shifted. It moved, circling me now, weaving through the trees, coming from multiple directions at once. I shivered, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Calm, step by step, focus. I moved toward the old cabins, thinking perhaps the sound would dissipate if I left the playground behind. But as I passed the first cabin, the laughter did not fade. It was joined by whispers, soft and indistinct, like voices speaking in a language I almost recognized, almost understood, but never fully. My chest tightened, and I felt the oppressive weight of the night pressing against me. I tried to call out again, louder this time, "Who's there?" My voice bounced off the trees, fatting into the darkness. The laughter stopped for a moment, replaced by silence so heavy it was almost tangible. Then, just as suddenly, it returned. A single, piercing giggle that felt impossibly close, right behind me, though when I spun around, the space was empty. Panic, slow and creeping, began to settle in my stomach. My rational mind wanted to flee, to escape this place and its impossible sounds. But something held me there, a morbid curiosity, an unwillingness to leave the echoes unexplored. I moved cautiously, stepping over roots and broken boards, flashlights sweeping the shadows. Every step seemed amplified, every rustle magnified. The forest around me was alive, patient, observing. I came to the edge of the clearing where the main lodge had once stood. The building was barely recognizable, a collapsed skeleton of wood and stone. But the laughter seemed strongest here, as if the spirits of the past were drawn to its remains. I knelt, trying to focus, shining my light into the darkened interior. Empty. Nothing remained but rubble and dust, yet the giggles continued, circling me, teasing me. I remembered the old case files, the stories I had read long before I arrived here. Children disappearing, never found, their laughter replaced by silence. Parents desperate, search parties combing the forest for days, weeks, months, finding nothing. I had thought of those stories as distant, abstract horrors. Now, standing in this campground at night, listening to laughter that could not belong to anyone living, I felt the reality of it pressing down. The forest remembered. It remembered those who vanished. It remembered their voices, their joy, their presence, and it allowed me to hear them, whether I wanted to or not. I stumbled forward, flashlight trembling in my hand. The laughter shifted again, coming from the tree line now, threading between the trees, rising and falling as if carried by an unseen current. My mind tried to track it, to pinpoint its source, but it was impossible. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom woven into the very night. I realized then that I had become part of the forest's memory, another observer, another participant in a story that refused closure. I took another slow step and the giggling stopped. The silence that followed was so intense it pressed into my ears, a hollow vacuum that made my heart pound. Then, just as I exhaled, resigned, the laughter returned, closer, almost right next to me. I spun, flashlight cutting across shadows, but again there was nothing. My reflection in a broken window caught my eye. Pale, drawn, and wide-eyed, I looked like one of the lost, staring out from the dark. I backed away slowly, feeling the night shift around me, aware that every shadow might hide something watching. The laughter followed, not constantly, but in bursts, soft, fleeting, teasing like a child darting between trees. I realized I could not chase it, could not escape it. It was part of the air, part of the forest, part of the abandoned campground itself. The playground came back into view. Swings swayed gently, the slide glinting faintly in the moonlight. I felt a wave of nausea, a realization that the forest, the campground, the laughter, they were all linked. Memories or echoes of memories trapped here, replaying endlessly. And I was intruding, an uninvited guest listening to voices that had no reason to exist anymore. I whispered to myself, trying to anchor my mind. It's just memory, it's just echoes. But the words felt hollow. Memory could be cruel, could twist and reach into the present, and here, in this abandoned place, the echoes had taken form. They were insistent, impossible to ignore. I moved again toward the far end of the campground, where the old trail led back toward the road. The laughter seemed to follow me, moving just out of reach, fading only when I stopped. I realized that it would not relent. It did not want to end. It wanted witnesses. And I was exactly that, someone who had heard, who had stepped into a space the world had long forgotten. The moon had risen slightly, casting long, thin shadows across the ruined campground. I could see the gates in the distance now, rusted and silent, the threshold between the forest's memory and the world beyond. I walked slowly, careful not to rush, careful not to provoke the forest's attention further. The laughter came and went, fading into the tree line, leaving me with the weight of absence. As I reached the gates, I paused, looking back at the empty campground. The shadows seemed to press closer, the silence heavy, the echoes lingering. I realized then that this place, these ruins, these memories, would follow me in my mind, in my dreams, perhaps forever. The laughter was not meant for me, not truly, but it had claimed a piece of me nonetheless. I stepped through the gates, the cold metal rusted and rough against my hand. The campground lay behind me, silent once more, but the night had changed. Every tree, every shadow, every memory remained, pressing into my consciousness. I could not unhear the laughter, could not unsee the echoes of children long gone. And as I walked back toward the road, the soft, haunting sound of giggles threaded through the night, carried by a forest that never truly forgets. And I knew that the echoes of this place would remain, quietly, patiently, rusting in the dark alongside the gates. The further I wandered into the campground, the heavier the night became. The laughter had faded into whispers, lingering only in my imagination now, but the sense of being watched had not left me. I followed the cracked asphalt road, weaving between the broken cabins that leaned like old men, exhausted from years of neglect. Some had lost doors entirely, others had gaping holes in their roofs, letting the moonlight slice through in thin, cold beams. I paused at each one, flashlight trembling slightly in my hand, not out of fear exactly, but out of respect for the stories these structures carried. I approached a cluster of cabins that seemed smaller, more personal than the others, as if they had once been family units rather than generic camp housing. The wood was dark and damp, nails protruding at odd angles, and a faint scent of mold lingered in the air. I knelt to examine a doorway, noticing the remains of a welcome mat, frayed and gray, almost unrecognizable. I pushed the door open slowly. It creaked, though the hinges were mostly gone, and the darkness inside seemed to inhale me immediately. Inside, the cabin was small and tight, the floorboards warped and uneven. Dust coated everything, and spiderwebs draped the corners like forgotten curtains. My flashlight caught the glint of metal, and I moved closer. A small trunk lay near the wall, lid partially open, its lock rusted and useless. I hesitated before lifting the lid fully. Inside were remnants of lives abruptly paused. A child's worn backpack, a faded notebook with half-smudged scribbles, a thermos with the paint chipped away. Each item felt heavy, laden with absence. I ran my fingers lightly over the notebook. The pages were filled with childish handwriting, sentences unfinished, drawings of stick figures in the forest. One page had a small, crude sketch of a figure hiding behind a tree, watching. My stomach twisted. The figure, though simple, seemed deliberate, almost too precise for a child's imagination. I swallowed and pulled back slightly. The air felt colder here, as if the cabin itself had retained the chill of that day when its occupants had disappeared. I imagined them inside, parents arranging their things, children laughing, doors closing behind them, and then, suddenly, gone. The echo of that disappearance pressed against my mind, heavy and relentless. I stepped further into the cabin, careful not to disturb too much. On a small table near the window, I found a set of mugs, half coated in dust but otherwise untouched. A photograph lay face down. I flipped it over and my flashlight illuminated the image. A family, smiling at the camera, standing in front of this very cabin, unaware that this night would mark the beginning of their absence. I felt a chill run down my spine. The faces looked so alive, yet the setting so familiar, so impossibly still in the present. I moved toward the bunks in the corner. Sheets yellowed and threadbare, pillows flattened and stiff. Something about them disturbed me. Perhaps the idea that people had once slept here, woke here, and then were gone. The notion of sudden disappearance made the air thick. I pressed my hand to the wall, feeling the grain of the wood, the rough texture grounding me in the reality of the moment. The stories I had read, the police reports, the missing person notices, all suddenly seemed tangible here. A small toy lay near the bunks, a wooden horse, the paint worn almost entirely away. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. I could imagine a child clutching it to their chest as they slept, unaware of the unseen forces that might have been gathering in the shadows outside. The thought lingered, unwelcome but insistent. I set the toy back down, careful not to jostle it too much, and moved toward the window. Through the broken glass, I could see the shadows of the surrounding trees, long and thin in the moonlight. The branches swayed gently, and for a moment I could almost hear the whisper of the forest again, a subtle sigh like the breath of something old and patient. I shook my head and looked back at the cabin's interior. Something had changed in the air. The sense of weight of memory had deepened. I felt the eyes of the past, watching, silent, unwavering. On the floor near the bunk, I noticed footprints, faint, almost erased by time, but there. I knelt to examine them, brushing away some of the dust. The prints were small, child-sized, and they led toward the door. I traced the path with my finger, noting how they ended abruptly in the middle of the floor, as if the child had simply vanished. My breath caught. I had read about cases like this, details in reports, but seeing a trace, even faint, made it real in a way no newspaper ever could. I stepped back, taking a deep breath. I tried to remind myself that I was alone, that these were just remnants, objects frozen in time, and that my imagination was filling in the gaps. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that the cabin itself remembered, that it had stored the last moments of its occupants, and that those moments were reaching for me. I moved toward the corner where a trunk had been left ajar. Inside, more personal belongings. Clothes folded neatly, a pair of shoes lined up, a half-finished puzzle. Each item told a story, a brief glimpse of life interrupted. I ran my hand over a small sweater, feeling the threadbare fabric, and thought about the person who had worn it, the hands that had folded it, the laughter that had once filled the cabin. And then nothing. Silence, heavy and complete. A sound made me pause. The soft creak of a floorboard, distant, almost imperceptible. My flashlight beam swung instinctively toward it, landing on a corner of the cabin that seemed darker, colder. Nothing moved. I told myself it was the house settling, the wind through the broken windows, but my gut tightened. The forest outside the cabin, the abandoned campground, had made me realize that silence could be deceptive, that absence could feel alive. I knelt by the small table, touching the mugs lightly. One was tipped over, almost imperceptibly, as if nudged by a hand too faint to see. I felt a shiver travel down my spine. The air was dense, charged with memory, with traces of lives that had been here and were no longer. I imagined the people who had vanished, the parents, the children, their last moments, ordinary and terrifying in equal measure. I felt their presence pressing into the corners, into the dust, into the very air I breathed. The flashlight beam caught something on the wall. A mark scratched into the wood, a series of lines, almost tally marks, uneven, desperate. I ran my finger over them, counting silently. 7. 7 tallies, deeply etched, as if someone had kept track of days, of fear, of waiting. The thought twisted in my stomach. Had someone been here, counting the time, the moments, until something took them? Or until they disappeared? I could not know, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. I backed away from the wall slowly, careful not to disturb anything further. My mind tried to process what I had seen, the belongings, the footprints, the marks, and make sense of it. But sense was impossible here. The forest had already claimed this place. The campground had already absorbed the echoes of the missing, and I was merely an intruder, threading through layers of memory too heavy to fully comprehend. I turned toward the door, deciding it was time to leave, when I noticed something I had missed before, a small, faded photograph pinned to a beam, half torn. It showed 3 children smiling, arms around each other, standing in front of this very cabin. Their eyes seemed impossibly alive, looking straight at me, and for a moment I felt a weight in my chest, as if they were aware of my presence. I could almost hear the echoes of their laughter from before, softer now, like a memory drifting back across the years. I took a deep breath and stepped back, realizing I had spent too long inside. The cabin had claimed a piece of me, a fragment of my attention, my awareness, and I felt that leaving now would not erase it. I turned toward the door, flashlight trembling in my hand, and stepped outside. The forest seemed to shift as I emerged, shadows lengthening, moving as if aware of my exit. I glanced back at the cabin, dark and silent once more, and I could almost sense it breathing, exhaling decades of trapped moments, memories of lives interrupted. I felt the weight of it pressing into me, the quiet insistence that the stories here were not finished, that they never would be. I walked away slowly, keeping the flashlight pointed ahead, though the path was clear now. The other cabins loomed, silent and empty, witnesses to the past, holding the secrets of vanished campers and abandoned belongings. I realized then that this campground, with its forgotten cabins and quiet memories, had claimed me in its own subtle way. I could leave physically, but it would follow me, haunting my thoughts, creeping into my dreams. And as I stepped onto the old road that led back toward the gates, I understood that the cabin, the belongings, the footprints, the marks, was more than a structure. It was a vessel of absence, a silent record of vanished lives, a reminder that some stories never end, that some memories persist, rusting quietly in the dark, waiting for anyone who dared to notice. I didn't mean to find it. The forest seemed normal at first, just shadows stretching long under the moonlight, branches swaying softly as if the night itself was breathing. I was following the faint path that led deeper into the campground, the echo of the abandoned cabin still pressing on my mind, when I stumbled across a shallow depression in the earth. It was uneven, half hidden beneath fallen leaves and pine needles, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Something about it made me pause. My gut tightened, an instinctive warning that I couldn't quite name. I crouched down, brushing aside the leaves. The soil was soft here, damp from recent rain, and I noticed an odd disturbance, clumps of earth that had been turned over, not naturally, but as if someone or something had dug here recently or long ago. The trench was shallow, maybe 2 feet wide and 4 feet long, but the air around it felt heavier, charged with an invisible presence. My hand hovered over the earth, hesitant, and then I pressed my fingers against it. It was cold, surprisingly so, and the scent hit me then. A faint metallic tang like iron mixed with the musk of decay. I swallowed and stepped back, trying to steady my thoughts. I reminded myself that forests hold all kinds of debris, animals, fallen branches, erosion. But something about this trench felt deliberate, purposeful. I crouched again, flashlight angled carefully across the depression. Small fragments caught the beam. A splintered piece of wood, half-buried cloth, tiny shards of what looked like ceramic. My pulse quickened, not from fear exactly, but from the awareness that these remnants were human-made, evidence of a story left behind, fragments of something unresolved. I ran my fingers over the edge of the trench. The soil had been compressed in places, as though someone had knelt there repeatedly. I tried to imagine the sequence, someone kneeling, digging, burying, but the image refused to form fully. The trench seemed to resist explanation, its origin deliberately obscured by time and leaves and shadows. I leaned closer and saw the first clear sign of something far darker than fallen leaves. A small, worn shoe, half covered in soil, barely visible. It was a child's size, scuffed and cracked, the leather soft from moisture but unmistakable. I froze, breath catching in my throat. I had read about missing children in this forest, cases that went cold, files stacked in drawers gathering dust. And here it was, a piece of that story lying quietly under the moonlight. I touched it gently, unwilling to disturb it more than necessary, but needing the confirmation that this wasn't imagination. The air felt thicker now, almost suffocating, as if the trench itself had absorbed the last moments of whoever had been here. I noticed more objects half buried in the soil, a torn jacket button scattered across the ground like frozen raindrops, and then further along a fragment of a journal page. The paper was damp, curled at the edges, the ink smudged beyond recognition. I picked it up carefully, letting the flashlight illuminate the faint marks. I could make out a few letters, a name perhaps, or a place, but nothing complete. The ambiguity was worse than clarity. The unknown pressed on me harder than any certainty could. I stepped back, breathing slowly, trying to ground myself. The forest was quiet here, too quiet. The only sounds were the distant rustle of branches and my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. I realized that I had been holding my breath. I exhaled slowly and let my gaze sweep over the trench again. The arrangement of objects felt intentional, a record left by someone or something, of a moment meant to be remembered or hidden. I noticed marks along the trench's sides, scratches, shallow but deliberate, as if someone had clawed at the earth with urgency. I crouched, tracing them with my flashlight beam. The lines weren't random, they formed angles, a pattern that my mind tried and failed to interpret. Symbols, perhaps, or a child's desperate attempt to communicate something before it was too late. I pressed my hands against the ground, imagining the weight of the body or bodies that might have rested here, the finality of silence settling over them. The metallic scent of iron grew stronger as I moved closer, a reminder that the earth had retained its memory of blood, even decades later. My stomach churned. I wanted to step back, to walk away and leave this trench to the forest, but some part of me, the part that had drawn me to these abandoned places, to the echoes of the missing, compelled me to continue. I knelt and swept away more leaves, revealing fragments of fabric, fibers twisted into the soil. And then, unmistakably, a small bone, bleached and fragile, peeking from beneath the earth. I closed my eyes briefly, taking a slow breath. The human mind resists such discoveries, but there was no denying it. These remnants were proof, a connection to the unsolved, the vanished, the stories I had read only in headlines and cold reports. I leaned closer, careful not to disturb the fragile traces, and tried to imagine the moment when this trench had been filled. The fear, the desperation, the inevitability of it, all pressed against me like a physical weight. I scanned the surrounding forest, noticing how the trees seemed closer here, leaning in, their branches forming a near-complete canopy that blocked the moonlight. Shadows pooled in unnatural ways, dark hollows between roots and trunks. I felt eyes on me, not human eyes, but something that had watched this trench for years, waiting, patient and silent. I shook my head, telling myself that it was my imagination, that the mind played tricks when confronted with death and absence. Yet the sensation persisted, crawling along my spine, settling into the small of my back. I crouched lower, examining the trench with more care. A fragment of a child's toy, half buried, lay near the edge, a tiny wooden horse, its paint worn and chipped. I picked it up, turning it over in my fingers. The weight of the object was negligible, but the presence it carried was immense. I could almost see a small hand clutching it, small eyes glancing nervously at something unseen, and then silence. The image lingered, uninvited, and I felt the chill deepen in my chest. The trench extended a few more feet, revealing more fragments of clothing, tiny pieces of what might have been a backpack, and then something that made my stomach knot: footprints. Faint, small, child-sized, pressed into the soft earth as if someone had walked here recently. Or perhaps, impossibly, as if the earth remembered their passage and pressed it back into form. I traced them with my finger. They ended abruptly, vanishing in the middle of the trench, leaving only disturbed earth beyond. I swallowed hard, trying to regulate my thoughts. The evidence was undeniable, yet the context remained elusive. Who had done this? When? Why? And why had the forest held onto these traces, keeping them hidden until someone like me stumbled across them? I could feel the weight of unanswered questions pressing against me, insistent, unyielding. I stepped back, letting the flashlight sweep across the trench one last time. The fragments of life, the impressions of bodies, the faint traces of movement, they were all here, frozen in time, yet alive in the way only memory can be. The forest seemed to close in, the darkness pressing more closely, and I realized that this trench, this shallow scar in the earth, was more than a resting place. It was a witness, silent, patient, enduring. I felt a sudden need to leave, to distance myself from the trench before my mind filled in details that could never be confirmed. I rose slowly, brushing my hands against my pants to remove the damp soil. I glanced once more at the shallow depression, the fragments, the tiny shoe half buried, and a shiver passed over me. I could not erase what I had seen, could not unhear the whispers of the past, could not ignore the quiet insistence of absence. As I walked back toward the faint trail, I realized that the forest had changed. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more watchful. I could feel the presence of the trench lingering behind me, as if it had marked me, recording my passage in a way I would feel long after I left. The weight of the missing, the vanished, pressed into my memory, and I understood that the forest held these stories close, carefully, patiently, and that some truths are best not spoken, only remembered. I looked back once more, the shallow trench blending into the darkness, subtle and unassuming, yet infinitely powerful in its silent testimony. I knew I would return in thought, in dreams, carried back to the quiet disturbance in the soil, to the fragments of lives interrupted, to the lingering dread that only such places can preserve. And I walked on, careful not to step too quickly, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of absence that the forest had so carefully maintained. Night had settled over the forest like a thick, velvet curtain, muffling the sounds of the world outside and amplifying every small rustle within. The trench, the scattered fragments, the half-buried shoe, they all lingered behind me, etched into memory, as I followed the faint trail back toward what I hoped was safety. Each step was deliberate, slow, as if rushing might provoke the forest to notice me more fully, as if sudden movement could awaken whatever presence lay in the shadows. The canopy above had thickened, branches interlocking in jagged silhouettes that blocked the moonlight almost completely. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, a weak cylinder of white light that flickered slightly as my hand shook, more from tension than exhaustion. I felt, rather than saw, the shapes of the forest closing in, trunks leaning at odd angles, roots curling like grasping fingers, leaves whispering secrets to one another that I could not understand. I tried to remind myself that shadows were harmless, that the forest had always been like this, protective and secretive. But the stillness now felt unnatural, the kind of stillness that waits, watches, and remembers. I stopped for a moment, scanning the dense undergrowth on either side of the path, and that's when it happened, the first unmistakable sensation of eyes on me. I froze, not a glimpse, not a movement, but the prickling certainty that I was being observed. My neck stiffened, my heartbeat quickened, though I tried to slow it, breathing in carefully, out slowly. I told myself it was the mind playing tricks, a forest already saturated with missing persons, abandoned cabins, and shallow graves. But instinct doesn't rely on logic, and my instinct screamed that I was not alone. A twig snapped softly to my left, I swung my flashlight toward the sound, catching nothing but the familiar shapes of trees and undergrowth. I exhaled, shaking my head, trying to laugh it off. Yet even as I continued walking, each step felt heavier, each shadow stretching longer, and I could not shake the feeling that something or someone was following. Not walking exactly. Not human. Just moving in sync with me, unseen, patient. I thought of the missing campers, the children whose laughter I had heard echoing in the abandoned cabins, the trench with its fragments of lives lost. It all pressed in on me now, the stories converging in the night, a chorus of absence that I could not ignore. I wanted to call out, to speak to whatever lingered in the darkness, but my voice felt trapped in my throat, swallowed by the trees and leaves. I whispered to myself just to hear a human sound. I'm leaving. I'm leaving. The path shifted subtly, as if the forest itself was rearranging to confuse me. Roots seemed higher than they had moments ago. The trail widened, narrowed, then disappeared entirely, leaving me in a small clearing. My flashlight caught the remnants of old campfires, stones blackened by flames long dead, ashes scattered across damp soil. I remembered the stories of campers who never returned. My stomach tightened. I was here alone. I had never truly been alone in the way I was now. I stopped in the clearing, listening. The wind whispered through the trees, but there was something else. A murmur, almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves, a faint repetition of syllables that I could not parse. My imagination tried to supply words, and I fought it back. My mind had been running in circles since I entered the forest at dusk, filling in gaps with horror I hadn't witnessed. I wanted the rational explanation, yet part of me feared it, longed for the forest to remain unknowable. I stepped carefully around the stones of the old fire pit. My flashlight landed on something half buried beneath leaves, a small doll, its face cracked, one eye missing. The sight stopped me cold. I remembered a story from the missing persons files, a child last seen clutching a worn doll like this one. I knelt to pick it up, hands trembling, but even as I held it, the doll seemed too present. I couldn't shake the sensation that it was being held in return, that invisible hands grasped me through the night. I rose slowly, keeping the doll in my hand, and pressed on through the clearing. The trees here were spaced strangely, creating narrow corridors and open spaces in alternation. I felt watched from every angle, the unseen eyes shifting with me, sliding along branches, hiding in the dark recesses behind trunks. My pulse thumped, a loud, insistent rhythm that seemed amplified in the quiet. I tried to rationalize it, animals, maybe deer or foxes, but the feeling was wrong. The gaze was deliberate, calculating. It was something that waited. A low, almost imperceptible whisper brushed my ear. I spun, flashlight sweeping the clearing, catching only dancing shadows. My breath caught and I stepped backward, then forward again, trying to reassure myself. The whisper came again, more distinct this time, carried by the wind, or perhaps not the wind at all. "Don't leave," it seemed to say. The words were fragmentary, broken, like a half-remembered memory. I shivered, cold despite the sweat running down my back. I clutched the doll tighter, feeling its rough fabric against my palm. The air felt heavier here, saturated with the residue of absence, the weight of unspoken stories. The forest was not silent, it remembered, and it had a way of pressing those memories against anyone foolish enough to wander into its depths. I realized that fear wasn't my companion here. Curiosity was. My desire to know had brought me too far, and now the forest answered me in kind, quietly, insistently. I noticed the shadows shifting unnaturally at the edge of the clearing. They were too long, too angular, forming shapes that did not correspond to the trees. Something was moving, but not with the gait of a human. I froze, breath shallow, flashlight trembling in my grip. The shapes stretched and recoiled, pulling the darkness toward me. I wanted to turn, to run, but my feet felt rooted. My eyes scanned, desperate to locate a tangible source, a rational explanation, but there was nothing to see. Only the feeling, heavier now, that I was being observed, that the forest itself was alive and aware of my presence. I tried to whisper to myself again, words of reassurance that I was rational, that I could leave any time I wanted. But the sound of my own voice was swallowed, absorbed by the thick night. A rustle to my right, a soft, dragging sound made me swing the flashlight around. Nothing. And yet I could sense it, an unrelenting pressure, a constant awareness that threaded through the trees, brushing against my skin. I thought of my own shadow, cast weakly by the flashlight, wavering in the underbrush. For a moment, it seemed to separate from me, stretching, growing taller, longer, moving independently. I blinked and it snapped back to form, yet the sensation lingered. My mind questioned reality. Was the forest playing tricks, or had I crossed into a place where reality itself became fluid, where shadows had consciousness and the night could watch with intent? I took another cautious step forward. The air smelled damp and earthy, but beneath that was something acrid, metallic, familiar. The scent of the trench, the shallow grave, the remnants of lives lost. I realized then that the forest had a memory and it had not forgotten me. Every object, every fragment I had seen, every whisper of the missing, it all pressed together now, converging in the night around me. I could not ignore it, could not step around it. I was within its narrative, drawn into the story of absence and watching. I stumbled slightly, caught on a root, and almost dropped the flashlight. The beam caught the edge of another shallow depression in the soil. My stomach twisted. Another trench, or merely the illusion of one conjured by my mind straining to understand. I knelt, shining the light across the ground, but this one seemed empty, almost benign. Yet the memory of the last trench lingered, and I could feel the weight of invisible eyes pressing down, measuring, waiting. I rose slowly, turning in place to scan the clearing once more. The shadows seemed to pulse, breathing in tandem with me, as though the night itself had learned my rhythm. The whispering returned, carried just beyond comprehension, weaving in and out of the rustling leaves. I could not tell whether the sounds were voices or echoes of my own imagination. I could not tell whether the eyes were real or the impression of being watched implanted deep in my mind. And yet the feeling would not leave. The presence stayed, patient, silent, unseen. I could almost feel it shift behind me, slide along the trees, curl in the darkness. I pressed on, careful to keep the flashlight moving, careful to keep walking, careful to avoid stopping long enough for the sensation to overtake me completely. Every instinct urged me to flee, yet every part of me wanted to see, to understand, to bear witness. I knew then that I would carry this forest with me long after I left. Its weight, its gaze, its patient, persistent observation. It would haunt me in every quiet room, every shadowed corner. The night here was not simply darkness. It was an awareness, a living record, and I had become a part of it, however briefly. I finally broke through the edge of the clearing, the trees thinning just enough for the moonlight to reach me again. Relief washed over me, weak but real, though the feeling of eyes did not entirely fade. I glanced back once, half expecting to see shapes lingering at the tree line, half expecting nothing at all. The forest was silent, but it had left its mark. Its memory would trail me home, weaving into dreams, into thoughts, into quiet moments where the night pressed close, reminding me that some places do not forgive or forget. I held the doll in my hand until I reached the old trail that would eventually lead me out. I didn't speak, didn't move too quickly. I felt the forest's attention, the gentle but insistent reminder that I had been seen, noted, remembered. And as I walked, the shadows seemed to follow, just at the edges of my vision, flickering with each step, whispering with each rustle of leaves. Nightfall had deepened, and with it, the certainty that I had crossed a threshold, a place where reality was thin, and where the past never truly rested. I exhaled, letting the first hint of dawn's light warm my back, and yet even then, the sensation of being watched remained. I knew I would return in my thoughts, in dreams, in quiet, unguarded moments, haunted by the night, haunted by the eyes, haunted by the lingering, patient shadows that waited. The hum of the tires on gravel was almost hypnotic, a constant rhythm that filled the cab of the truck as I drove down the winding stretch of road. Moonlight glinted off the asphalt in broken shards, and the trees on either side leaned close, their branches clawing at the sky. I had driven this route countless times, but tonight the road felt different. Empty, yes, but heavy, as if it carried the memory of those who had come before me. I remembered the stories, though I tried not to. Truckers vanishing without a trace. Notes found scattered in rest stops, warning signs ignored or dismissed. Names of drivers whispered like curses among long-haul circles. I had scoffed at them during the day, laughing quietly in the diner over coffee with colleagues. But as night settled in and the gravel rattled beneath my wheels, the tailies returned, insistent. My headlights cut narrow channels through the darkness. The forest pressed close, dark shapes leaning in on either side, and I felt the familiar prickle of unease in my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination. Roads get lonely at night. Trees make shapes. Shadows move in ways the eye misinterprets. Logic, rational explanations. But even as I thought these things, my knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. A sudden dip in the road caused a jolt, and I caught myself muttering a curse under my breath. The gravel scattered, a small storm of dust and pebbles, and for a moment I thought I saw something, movement in the edge of my headlights. I blinked and it was gone. Perhaps a deer, perhaps nothing. My pulse thumped faster, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. This road demanded respect, not fear. Yet the stories clung to the night like fog. The radio offered little comfort. Static crackled between stations, distant and hollow, carrying no music, no voices, only an occasional whisper of sound that seemed almost familiar. My own breathing became louder in my ears, syncing with the rhythmic crunch of tires on gravel. I thought of the last driver who had taken this route. No one had seen him again. The delivery never made it. His truck, they said, was found months later, abandoned and empty, like a ghost frozen in time. I tried to focus on the mundane. The map pinned to the dashboard, the route ahead, the small cabin of my truck lit by dashboard lights. But the darkness pressed in and I felt watched. Not by a person, nothing human, but by the memory of the road itself, by every absence that had passed this way and never returned. Every vanished driver, every whispered warning became a presence in the cab with me. I took a deep breath and forced my eyes ahead, scanning the shadows beyond the reach of the headlights. There, just past a curve, a sign leaned slightly, weathered and faded. Caution, narrow road, no shoulder. Its paint was chipped, almost illegible, yet it seemed almost to pulse under my gaze as if it wanted me to notice it. The stories had never mentioned signs. They only mentioned disappearance, silence, and that endless stretch of gravel. A sudden sound, metallic and low, made me freeze, something scraping along the side of the truck. I stopped breathing. The tires continued their steady rhythm on the gravel, masking the source of the noise. I swiveled in my seat, scanning the periphery, but the trees offered nothing but shadows. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. Gravel, branches, loose metal in the road, these were explanations. I told myself this. Yet the hair on my arm stood straight, prickling against my jacket. I pressed forward, slower now, more deliberate. Every bend in the road felt like an entrance into a memory, a replay of things I had only heard in hushed conversations and online forums. They said the road was alive in a way, that it remembered every vehicle, every driver, every journey that had ended too soon. I tried to laugh at the thought, but swallowed it quickly. The wind in the trees carried a sound, faint but unmistakable, a whisper, almost human. Turn back. I snapped my eyes to the forest, expecting someone or something to be there. Nothing. Only trees, dark and unmoving, shadows folding into shadows. The voice was gone the moment I focused on it, like it had never existed. My chest tightened. I knew then that if I wanted to make it through, I had to keep moving. Keep the truck rolling, keep the tires crushing the gravel beneath me, and never stop. The road narrowed, hemmed in by tall pines whose roots snaked across the edges of asphalt, threatening to catch the wheels. Gravel shifted under the weight of the tires, sending a vibration up through the steering column. I forced my hands to remain steady, fingers wrapped around the wheel, heartbeat steadying after its sudden leap. In the mirrors, I caught fleeting shapes, branches, shadows, or the faint suggestion of movement, just a corner of the eye glimpse that made the imagination race. I remembered a forum post I had read, written by a driver who vanished and was never found. He spoke of the tires, how their sound became a mantra, how he began to feel the road beneath him breathe, alive with a consciousness he could not name. At the time, I dismissed it. Now I understood. Each crunch and crack of the gravel became a rhythm I could not escape, a pulse that reminded me the road itself was listening. The moon broke through clouds in a sudden sliver of light. For a moment I thought I saw a figure at the side of the road, leaning just beyond the reach of the headlights. A man, maybe, or a mannequin standing perfectly still. I blinked and it was gone. My stomach churned. I tried to tell myself my eyes were playing tricks. I tried to tell myself the stories were only stories. But the memory of vanished truckers, of their deliveries never reaching anyone, came rushing back, suffocating in its intensity. I gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white, and whispered to myself, "Just keep driving. Just keep driving." The gravel rattled under the tires like an endless heartbeat, a rhythm both comforting and terrifying. I couldn't stop. Every mile brought me closer to dawn, yes, but also deeper into the night's memory, deeper into the road's own story, which waited patiently for anyone foolish enough to travel it alone. A sudden dip and rise in the road sent a shudder through the truck. The headlights swung across something half buried in gravel, an old boot, cracked and faded. My stomach lurched. I remembered a missing driver, last seen wearing boots like these. The memory of him, lost to this stretch of road, pressed against me like a weight. I wanted to look away, but I could not. The road demanded acknowledgement. It demanded that I see what had come before and would come after. I felt it then, the road itself shifting beneath me, not physically but in sensation. The tires on gravel sounded slightly different now, deeper, resonant, as if echoing something buried beneath the surface. Shadows at the edges of my headlights flickered, elongated, and I could almost imagine them stretching toward the truck. My pulse thundered in my ears, yet I could not stop. I had to keep moving. I had to survive the rhythm, the road, the memory. I remembered advice from an older driver, a mentor who had warned me about roads like this. Never let the road see you hesitate. I understood now what he meant. Hesitation invited the unseen, invited the watching, invited the silence to take shape. I pressed forward, tires rattling over gravel, my hands steady, my eyes fixed on the narrow slice of illuminated asphalt before me. The night was thick, but the truck's rhythm was steady. I clung to it like a lifeline. And then, as the miles stretched on, the forest seemed to relax slightly. Shadows still lingered, and the feeling of unseen eyes never fully left, but I felt a small, fragile sense of control return. The gravel hummed beneath the tires, a constant companion, a reminder that movement was survival. I exhaled slowly, almost forgetting to breathe for a moment, and continued forward, each crunch, each vibration, each whispered echo marking my passage through the road that had swallowed so many before. I did not stop. I could not. The night stretched on, endless and patient, the trees silent witnesses, the gravel beneath me a song of survival. I thought of the drivers lost to this road, and a strange empathy washed over me. Perhaps they had seen what I was seeing. Perhaps they had felt the weight of the night, the pressure of the unseen. And perhaps in their own way, they had also been listening to the tires on gravel, keeping time with the road itself, a rhythm that demanded recognition, attention, and caution. By the time the first hint of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in faint shades of gray, I felt a cautious relief. The forest thinned, the road widened, and the presence pressing in on the cab eased slightly. I glanced in the rearview mirror once, half expecting to see something following. Nothing. Only the road stretching behind me, empty and silent but never forgetful. The memory of the night, of the tires on gravel, of the vanished drivers, would follow me long after this delivery, a shadow stitched into my mind. I drove on, knowing I had survived, but also knowing that the road, patient and relentless, would wait for the next vehicle, the next driver, the next set of tires on gravel to carry its story into the night again. The road had grown narrower as I pressed on, the forest closing in like a dark corridor that led nowhere. My tires rattled over the gravel, each bump under the truck a reminder that I was still moving, still alive, still following the path that had swallowed others before me. But tonight, the rhythm of the road was interrupted by something new, something that made my stomach tighten. The first time I saw it, I almost dismissed it as a trick of the moonlight. A tree, its bark split and scarred in ways that seemed deliberate. A crude mark, carved deep, jagged, as if someone had pressed a blade into it and let it bleed slowly over years. I rubbed my eyes, stared again, and there it was. Another mark on the next tree, and then another. Symbols, patterns, deliberate, a sequence I could not read but somehow understood in the small part of my mind that shivered without knowing why. I slowed the truck. My knuckles whitened on the wheel. I told myself it could be anything, a hunter, vandals, someone bored with the night. But the placement was too precise, too deliberate. Every mark appeared on the side I was traveling within sight of my headlights at intervals that seemed calculated. Someone or something was tracking me. The forest seemed to lean closer as I drove past. Branches scraped along the cab, the tires rattled on uneven gravel, and the wind carried whispers that were barely audible, almost drowned in the hum of the truck's engine. I imagined footsteps, maybe someone running parallel to me, but when I glanced in the mirrors, there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching behind me, lined with trees that now seemed to watch. I remembered the first story I had read about this stretch of road. A driver had spoken of marks on the trees, symbols carved by an unknown hand. He said the markings changed every time he looked away, that they sometimes appeared on trees that had been bare before. I had laughed when I read it, the same uneasy chuckle I sometimes give when telling myself a story is just a story. But now, looking at the hollowed trunk of the next tree, I understood. Those marks were real. And I was part of the pattern. The cab felt warmer than it should have, and I realized I was holding my breath. My heart drummed in my chest, loud enough to echo in my ears. I tried to focus on the mundane, the gauges, the road, the map tucked beside me. Anything to keep my mind from dwelling on the suggestion of eyes in the shadows. But the road itself seemed alive, carrying a memory, a warning, a patience that made me feel small and fragile. I slowed further, nearly crawling over the gravel. Every tree with a mark drew my gaze, each one more intricate than the last. Some were simple scratches, deep lines etched into the bark. Others were patterns, circles within triangles, jagged scratches that almost formed letters. I had no idea what they meant, but instinct told me they were a message. Not to anyone who passed this way before, but to me. I was being observed, documented, logged into the memory of the forest. A sudden breeze swept across the cab, carrying with it the faintest smell of smoke, charred wood, and something metallic that made my stomach lurch. I frowned. There had been no fire along this road, no accident, no human presence that I could see. Yet the scent lingered, heavy and insistent, weaving itself into the darkness. I shook my head, trying to banish it, but it clung. I thought again of the vanished truckers, the stories I had tried to ignore. Perhaps this was the same sense they had felt. The same intangible awareness that something was recording, following, waiting. I reached the largest of the marked trees, a hollow trunk so wide that I could have stepped inside it. My headlights illuminated the cavity, and I nearly swerved in shock. Inside, the bark was scarred with symbols unlike the others, deeper, more deliberate. Some appeared almost like initials. Others formed a crude spiral, a shape that seemed to pull at the edges of my vision. I blinked, trying to focus, and felt a wave of vertigo. The hollow felt like it was breathing, or maybe I was. I pressed my hands against the wheel, whispering to myself, "It's just wood, just marks, just a tree." But the words felt empty. The forest around me was silent, yet it carried a presence patient and observant. I had to move. I had to keep going. Hesitation, I knew, invited observation, invited danger. Tires on gravel, heartbeat on pace, I eased forward, each mark a reminder that I was not alone. The next bend brought another series of marks, lower this time, closer to the ground. I slowed again, craning my neck to see. There, a pattern I recognized, a sequence matching the first tree. Someone or something was mapping me, tracking me, documenting my passage. The thought sent chills down my spine. I imagined a figure crouched just beyond the reach of the headlights, watching, recording, noting every movement. I knew there was no one visible. I knew it. Yet the unease persisted, a weight pressing against my chest. My mind drifted to the stories of drivers who had vanished here. One had spoken of symbols that changed overnight, marks that moved when no one was looking. Another mentioned a hollow tree that seemed to breathe when approached. I had dismissed these accounts as exaggeration, sleep-deprived ramblings of those who had driven too far into night. But now, staring at the hollow, scarred trunks, I understood. The forest had a memory. It remembered the passage of tires. It remembered the people who had traveled here. And it had ways of marking them, of leaving signs that whispered in the dark. The road curved again, and I noticed something that made my breath catch. In the distance, the headlights caught a flash of something bright against the dark trunks. A reflective surface, a fragment of glass. I couldn't tell. I slowed, edging closer, gripping the wheel until my knuckles ached. The closer I got, the more I realized it was a symbol etched into the bark, filled with some substance that reflected light like water. I couldn't identify it, couldn't place it, but it seemed to pulse in the headlights, a heartbeat synchronized with my own. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm the sudden panic that threatened to overwhelm me. This was a road with memory, a forest with patience. Symbols etched in bark, hollows that breathed, and the faintest whisper in the wind telling me I was being watched. I reminded myself of the mundane. Trees grow, people carve, nights are long. But the hollow tree, the symbols, the sequence, they were not random. They were deliberate, they were calculated, and they were meant for me. I pressed forward again, careful not to look too long at any single mark. The rhythm of the tires on gravel returned. A steady pulse to anchor me. I whispered under my breath, a mantra against fear. Keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. I imagined the vanished drivers, their tires crunching over this same gravel, their eyes catching the same hollow trees, their hearts hammering in the dark. Perhaps they had seen the marks and understood, perhaps not. Perhaps that was why they never returned. A sudden rustle in the brush made me jump. Branches shook, leaves scattered, and for a brief moment I imagined someone stepping out from the shadows. But the road was empty. Only the forest, patient, silent, marking every mile, every turn, every passage of tires. I swallowed hard, reminding myself that I was alone. Yet alone felt different now. Alone felt like being inside a living memory, a forest that watched and waited and remembered. By the time I reached the end of the hollow stretch, the marks were fewer, more scattered. My heartbeat had slowed slightly, though the sense of observation lingered. The moon had shifted, casting silver light across the road, illuminating it like a path to somewhere unknown. I glanced in the mirrors, half expecting to see something following. Nothing. Only the road stretching behind me, a trail of hollow trees and symbols marking my passage. I exhaled, leaning back slightly in my seat. Tires on gravel, eyes on the road, hands on the wheel. The forest had left its memory, a breadcrumb trail that I could never unsee. I knew I would remember the hollow trees, the carvings, the symbols etched into bark for the rest of my life. And I knew in some quiet, unnerving way that the road and the forest had noticed me, cataloged me, and would carry the record forward for anyone who came after. I pressed on, knowing the marks would fade behind me, but their presence would linger. Hollow trees, carvings, symbols, they were reminders that the forest was patient, observant, and never truly empty. Every driver who passed here became part of its memory, and now I was part of it too. The ridge rose ahead of me like a shadowy wall, the road winding upward through a tangle of trees and underbrush. I had driven this stretch countless times during daylight when the forest felt alive but harmless. Now in the dark, it was a different place entirely. A low mist had begun to curl along the ground, a fog that thickened with every turn, clinging to the trees and seeping into the cab. Headlights cut through it, but only for a few feet ahead. Beyond that, the world was a blur of silver and gray, the edges of reality fraying at the corners of my vision. I slowed the truck, the tires crunching over gravel that sounded deafening in the stillness. The fog swallowed the familiar landmarks, and suddenly I was unmoored. The ridge could have been anywhere, the road stretching endlessly into a ghostly gray void. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just condensation, just night air settling, but the chill that ran down my spine told a different story. Something about this fog felt deliberate, purposeful, as if it had formed to hide or reveal, depending on its own will. I remembered the reports, the old articles about drivers who vanished here. They spoke of sudden fogs that appeared without warning, dense enough to isolate vehicles from the world. Some said it hid the dead, the bodies that littered the roadside, waiting for someone to stumble across them. I had always dismissed those claims. I had to. Otherwise, I would never have taken this route. But now, creeping along the ridge, I understood why the stories persisted. As I ascended, the fog thickened to the point where the cab's headlights barely illuminated more than a few yards. The trees became specters, their branches reaching like fingers into the mist. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, my knuckles pale, my jaw tense. Every few moments, I thought I saw shapes moving at the edge of the lights, shadows that were too deliberate to be random branches. I told myself they were illusions, tricks of the fog and my own anxiety. Still, the instinct to be alert burned in me, sharper than any rational thought. A flash of something on the roadside made me jerk the wheel slightly. Gravel shifted under the tires as I slowed to a crawl, straining my eyes through the mist. There it was, a flattened shape, half hidden in the fog, half buried in the mud and leaves. I couldn't tell at first what it was. A log, a fallen branch. Then I noticed the unnatural angles, the way it lay. Human. I swallowed hard. My breath fogged inside the cab, mingling with the chill seeping through the windows. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving, but curiosity, and something deeper, something I couldn't name, drove me closer. I rolled the truck to the side of the road, careful not to step into the fog beyond the headlights. My heart hammered, each beat a drum of alarm echoing through my chest. The shape was indeed human, or had been. Clothes matted with mud and leaves clung to the form. The features were obscured, distorted by time and the elements, but I could make out what remained. A hand, fingers curled unnaturally, a shoe half covered in gravel, the vague impression of a face pressed into the dirt. I swallowed again, forcing my gaze downward, forcing my mind to reconcile the reality with what I had imagined. This was no accident. The way the body lay, the remnants of clothing, the way the fog clung to it, it was deliberate. Evidence of something past, something the ridge had swallowed long ago. I stepped back into the cab, my hands trembling as I locked the doors. Tires on gravel, fog pressing against the glass, I tried to focus on the mundane task of driving. The ridge rose ahead, dark and unyielding, and the road seemed narrower than it should have been, almost as if it had contracted around me. Another flash of something bright caught my eye, metal, glinting faintly in the fog. I eased closer cautiously, realizing it was a fragment of a license plate, twisted and worn. Perhaps from one of the vanished truckers, perhaps from someone who had tried to escape and never made it. I had no answers, only the sense that the ridge held memories, and it chose carefully who could see them. And tonight, it had chosen me. The fog seemed to shift, rolling in waves that carried a faint scent, damp earth, decaying leaves, and something more acrid, almost like iron. My stomach churned. I pressed on slowly, every sense straining. Shapes appeared and vanished at the periphery of my vision. A tree that looked like a figure, a rock that seemed to pulse with movement, a shadow that crouched and disappeared when I blinked. I reminded myself, keep driving, don't stop, don't look too long, keep moving. I remembered the vanished drivers, how many had slowed to inspect, how many had dared to step closer to see what the ridge wanted them to see. I imagined them here in the fog a few steps ahead of me, their tires long since quiet, their bodies folded into the landscape. And I realized that the ridge had a rhythm, a patience. It did not rush. It did not panic. It waited for attention, waited for curiosity, and only then did it reveal what it wanted. Another body, I realized with a cold twist of recognition, lay further along. I could see the outline faintly through the mist, a leg, a shoe, the angle of a torso suggesting that the person had fallen and never moved again. I pressed my hands to the wheel, telling myself I had seen enough, that I had to keep going. But the ridge seemed endless, the fog unbroken, the past pressing on from every side. I thought about reporting this, calling the authorities, leaving evidence behind. But the thought felt wrong, almost foolish. The ridge didn't respond to logic. It didn't react to help. It simply existed, recording, marking, preserving. And I was passing through it now, a witness and an intruder in equal measure. The next stretch of road narrowed further, the trees leaning in close, their branches scratching against the cab like fingernails. The fog thickened, nearly blinding me. I drove at a crawl, my tires crunching over the gravel, every nerve taut. In the dim light, I saw the last fragment, a patch of disturbed earth, leaves trampled into mud, and something that could have been a footprint or an impression of a hand. I had no way of knowing. It could have been days, weeks, months old. But the ridge had left its signature, and I could not ignore it. I took a deep breath, the air damp and cold in my lungs, and tried to focus on the road. The fog had a quality to it, an almost tactile presence, like it was pressing against my skin, guiding me, warning me, keeping me tethered to this path. I whispered to myself, "Keep moving, don't stop, don't stop." Each repetition of the words was both comfort and spell, a fragile tether to sanity. I passed the last hollow, twisted tree along this stretch, and the fog thinned slightly. The road began to flatten, the ridge losing its oppressive slope. Yet the sense of being watched persisted. Eyes in the mist, shadows that had followed silently, waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to falter. I knew that even as I drove away, the ridge would retain its memories, storing the evidence, the bodies, the traces of those who had come before. And I knew deep down that it would remember me too. By the time I emerged from the fog, the world felt different, altered in a subtle way. The headlights cut through the darkness once more, the forest retreating to either side. Gravel rattled under the tires, the same as it had for miles, yet the lingering sense of unease refused to leave. I realized I had been part of something much larger than a road, a forest, a ridge. I had passed through a memory, a witness to a quiet, patient recording of past horrors. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of what I had seen, what I had almost touched, pressing against my chest. Fog on the ridge was not merely mist. It was a filter, a lens through which the past could be glimpsed, a guardian of secrets, and I had stumbled into its view. Tires on gravel, heartbeat steady, eyes forward. I knew that the ridge had granted me a small mercy, passage but not understanding. I would leave, but the memory of the fog, of the bodies, of the carved, hollowed trees, would stay with me forever. The road narrowed again, the trees closing in like walls, their branches interlocking above the cab to form a tunnel of shadows. The fog lingered lightly now, brushing against the windshield and slipping between the cracks of the doors, a reminder that the ridge's memory still clung to me. Every mile felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself were pressing against my chest. I tried to keep my focus on the gravel under the tires, the monotonous crunch beneath the wheels, but the forest had a rhythm of its own, one that made it impossible to forget where I was, or why I was there. I passed an old sign, its paint long since peeled away, leaving only the faint outline of letters that were almost unrecognizable. My heart thumped sharply when I realized it read "Last Stop," though I could not remember seeing this marker on any map, nor had I ever heard of it before. The letters were crooked, carved roughly into the wood as if by hand, and yet they seemed to shimmer slightly in the low light of my headlights. I blinked and the shimmer vanished, leaving the sign dull and lifeless again. The words echoed in my mind, "Last Stop." The name settled there, heavy, uncomfortable, a warning I could not ignore. I slowed to a crawl, instinct screaming that this stretch of road was different, unnatural in a way I could not name. The trees pressed closer, their shadows moving subtly as though they were aware of me, following each movement of the truck. The gravel beneath my tires felt uneven, as if the road itself were shifting, guiding me, keeping me on this path. My eyes darted from side to side, trying to make sense of the forest, trying to reassure myself that it was only trees, only mist, only shadows. But the shapes were deliberate now, too deliberate to be random. Branches leaned like outstretched arms, knots in the bark resembling eyes, and the underbrush seemed to twitch with unseen motion. I remembered the bodies, the fragments I had seen on the ridge. I had told myself I had left them behind, that the forest was behind me now, but a nagging unease whispered otherwise. I realized that the forest was not simply a setting. It was a participant, a recorder of events, a collector of those who came too close. And tonight, I was another participant, perhaps already recorded, perhaps already claimed in memory if not in body. A faint sound drifted through the cab, soft, almost imperceptible like gravel shifting beneath bare feet. I froze, hands tightening on the wheel. The sound was behind me, then to my right, then gone. I told myself it was the wind, a deer, a rock dislodged by gravity. But I had learned to listen to the forest, to notice when things were out of place. And this sound was out of place. It had intent. It was aware. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but the headlights barely penetrated the thickening canopy of branches. The gravel seemed endless, curling upward and back on itself, as if the road were folding into the forest. I realized with a sudden, chilling clarity that the ridge, and this stretch beyond the last stop sign, did not want me to leave. I had entered a corridor of memory and intention, and it had already begun to exert its control. The fog thickened again, curling around the truck, filling the cab with a damp, earthy chill. The scent of decay returned, subtle at first, but growing stronger with each turn of the wheels. It was the same scent I had noticed on the ridge: wet earth, leaves, and iron. I swallowed hard, the taste metallic in my mouth. My breath fogged the glass as I exhaled, and I felt the weight of every mile I had traveled pressing down, each one a reminder of the unseen presence that shared the road with me. I passed a small clearing, faintly illuminated by my headlights. In the center lay remnants of what could have been a campsite: a burned-out fire ring, scattered cans, a tattered blanket. Nothing appeared recent, yet the placement felt deliberate. I could almost sense the hands that had left these items, the silent intention behind each scatter, each mark. The forest was meticulous, documenting every intrusion, every trespass, every step taken along its hidden paths. As I drove, I noticed more details that unsettled me. The trees had scars, deep gashes that formed strange patterns, almost like symbols. They were not natural, not the result of weather or animals. Someone or something had left these marks, and I understood that they were part of the forest's memory, warnings etched in wood to tell a story I could only half read. Each symbol seemed to pulse faintly in the peripheral light, as if the forest wanted me to notice, but not fully understand. I tried to rationalize, to calm my thoughts. Perhaps the previous truckers had made these marks. Perhaps the forest was a site of illegal activity, accidents, or worse. My mind grasped for explanations, but each theory was more fragile than the last. The road felt endless, the forest alive, aware, and patient. Every shadow suggested eyes watching. Every movement in the underbrush suggested intent. The fog, the symbols, the clearing. It was a coordinated effort, deliberate and precise, to make me aware that I had entered a realm where leaving might not be simple. The road bent again, sharply this time, and I saw movement in the fog. Figures, perhaps human, perhaps not, flickered at the edges of my vision. I blinked and they were gone, leaving only the impression that I had not been alone for a moment. My pulse quickened, not in panic, but in recognition of the forest's persistence. I had entered its memory, and it was conscious of my presence. The ridge had shown me bodies, the fog had isolated me, and now the forest itself was making its awareness known. A low wind swept through the trees, carrying with it faint whispers. At first I could not understand them, but as I listened I realized they were voices, indistinct but human, faint laughter, murmurs, fragments of conversation frozen in time. I strained to hear, to decipher, but they remained just out of reach, teasing the edge of perception. I pressed my hands to my ears for a moment, then released them, realizing that blocking the sound did nothing. The voices were part of the road, part of the forest, part of the memory itself. They were not asking for attention, they were insisting on it. The tires rattled over gravel once more, and I noticed fresh impressions in the dirt along the shoulder. Footprints, human and deliberate, leading alongside the road, but none seeming to continue past my current position. The prints were oddly deep, as though whoever made them was heavy or the ground unusually soft. I could not discern whether they belonged to someone who had passed before me or something that existed alongside me now, unseen. I kept driving, reluctant to stop, knowing that stopping would invite attention, perhaps scrutiny from forces I could not comprehend. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. Time became indistinct. The road curved, the fog shifted, and the forest pressed close in a quiet, suffocating embrace. I realized that I could not remember seeing the same stretch of road twice, yet I could not be certain I was moving forward. The forest had a way of folding space, or perhaps I was losing my grip on reality. Each mile was a test, each turn a challenge of perception. I understood now why drivers had vanished here. This was a corridor of disorientation, a place where memory, perception, and the natural world collided into something beyond ordinary understanding. I thought about calling someone, sending a message, leaving a trail, but the signals were weak. Fatting in the dense canopy and mist, my phone felt useless, my voice alone. I was entirely at the mercy of this road, this forest, this ridge. And yet, even in that helplessness, I recognized a strange, unsettling clarity. The forest did not act with malice. It did not rush to claim or harm. It simply existed, maintaining its own memory, enforcing its own rhythm. I was merely a visitor, marked by awareness and curiosity. The road bent sharply one last time, and I saw another sign. Weathered and leaning, the wood almost rotted away. It bore a single word: departure. I exhaled sharply, expecting relief, but found none. The forest did not yield. The fog lingered, the whispers persisted, the shadows remained at the edges of perception. I realized then that leaving was not a simple act of driving forward. The road, the ridge, the forest, they were patient. They allowed passage, but only for those willing to respect the rhythm, to acknowledge the memory, to accept the unseen presence that accompanied every mile. I drove slowly, deliberately, tires crunching over gravel, hands white on the wheel. The forest remained close, alive, aware. The fog swirled around me, carrying with it the faint scent of earth, decay, and something else I could not name. Shadows shifted in the periphery, whispers trailed behind, and the road curved on endlessly, without promise of relief. I understood at last that this was not merely a stretch of gravel and trees. It was a living memory, a keeper of past tragedies, a corridor where curiosity met patience, and patience was the only guide to survival. I exhaled again, feeling the weight of what I had traversed, the knowledge of the forest's presence pressing against my mind. Tires on gravel, fog curling at the edges, shadows and whispers trailing in the periphery. I drove, aware that the road might never truly let me leave. And yet I moved forward, bound to its rhythm, marked by its memory, and tethered to the forest in a way that would not fade, long after the headlights disappeared into the night. I had just finished setting up my small campsite when the first whispers came through the radio. It was nothing but static at first, the low, crackling hum that always seemed to find its way into the quiet of the forest. I tuned the dial, fingers shaking slightly, and for a moment I thought it was just interference from the trees, the wind brushing against the antenna, or a passing vehicle miles away. But then I heard it. A voice, faint and stretched like it had been pulled through layers of distance and time. "Help," it said, almost swallowed by the static. My heart jumped. I leaned closer, adjusting the radio, turning the knob back and forth, trying to clear the interference. Each turn brought the voice a little closer, a little clearer, but also more desperate. "Please, can anyone hear me?" I froze. I was alone. I had been alone all day, hiking through trails that twisted deeper into the forest than I'd intended. No one was around, not even distant campers. And yet this voice, muffled, distorted, broken, spoke to me as though it had been waiting for me. The night was thick, heavier than it should have been. The moon barely reached through the dense canopy, leaving my campfire to fight against the shadows. Its glow was weak, dancing across the edges of trees that seemed to lean inward, listening. I shook my head and tried to convince myself it was just someone on a channel from another camp, a kid playing a prank, but the tone, there was a fear there I had never heard over a radio. It wasn't playful. It wasn't casual. It was raw, primal, and it pierced the quiet in a way that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I whispered back, though I knew there was no chance of being heard. "Hello, who's there?" My voice sounded small, swallowed almost immediately by the trees. There was no answer, only a crackle, a distorted stretch of noise that carried the echo of something like a scream. A long, drawn-out sound, fading into a silence that felt too deep to be natural. I pressed the radio closer, trying to discern anything, any signal of direction, any clue that this wasn't just my imagination. Then came another voice, different, lighter, but just as desperate. "Don't come," it hissed, the words dragging, distorted. I froze, my breath catching. My hands gripped the radio tighter than they needed to. The forest felt suddenly alive, every branch and leaf whispering, swaying though the wind had stopped. I realized with sudden clarity that I had no way to know where the voice was coming from. It was around me, through me, and yet nowhere I could point to. I sat down on the edge of my cot, staring into the shadows beyond the firelight. Each crackle of the radio seemed to sync with the rustle of the leaves, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, faint glimpses of figures just at the edge of vision. But when I blinked, they were gone. The forest was patient, silent, observing. I tried to tell myself it was only nerves, the isolation, but even that explanation felt hollow. The voice returned, this time pleading and fragmented. "Please don't leave me." The static warbled around it, stretching the syllables into something grotesque, something almost inhuman. I leaned closer, heart pounding. I had no idea whether it was a recording, someone in real danger, or something else. But the raw desperation made my skin crawl, made the forest feel suffocating, like it had its own pulse, matching mine. I grabbed my flashlight, letting the beam cut into the darkness, trying to reassure myself that nothing was moving just beyond the firelight. The trees seemed to shift slightly in the edges of the glow, casting shapes that made no sense. And every time I looked back at the radio, the voice whispered again, a low wailing now, distorted beyond recognition, yet undeniably human. Minutes passed. I could feel the night pressing closer, each sound amplified in the stillness. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch somewhere far ahead, the whisper of the wind, all seemed connected to the radio's cries. I considered shutting it off, telling myself I needed sleep, that the forest wasn't alive, that it wasn't calling for me. But I couldn't. My hands were stuck on the device as if it had become part of me. Another voice joined the first, soft and trembling, calling my name. I didn't respond. I didn't even know why it sounded like my name, but it did, echoing from the static in a way that felt intimate, frightening. I leaned back, trying to calm my racing thoughts, counting the fire's orange sparks as they floated into the night. Yet the whispers continued, layering over one another, building into a chorus of distress that made the air feel tight, thick, unbreathable. I remembered the stories, warnings I'd heard about this forest, about how people sometimes vanished and were never found. Silly, I thought, urban legends for hikers and campers. But now, sitting in the firelight with the radio trembling in my hands, I realized there was a truth to the warnings, a memory embedded in the trees themselves. Every story, every missing person, every unexplained scream, this forest carried them all. And tonight, it had chosen to show me a piece of that memory. I rose to my feet, trying to move away from the fire, away from the tent, but the radio insisted on its presence, the voices weaving around me like threads I could not escape. The distorted cries spoke of terror I could not see, of something trapped, something calling out through years of decay, through static and shadows, through layers of silence. Each plea pierced me, a reminder that the forest remembered, that it did not forgive, that it did not forget. I forced myself to step toward the edge of the camp, flashlight cutting a narrow path into the darkness. The voices followed, bending and stretching, echoing from every direction. I tried to move faster to shake the sense of being watched, but the night slowed me, thickened around me. Every step felt heavier, as though the forest itself resisted my movement, tugging me back into its memory, into the web of sounds that had ensnared me. Then I saw it, or I thought I did. A flicker at the edge of the beam, a shadow that moved independently, shifting with intent. I held my breath, frozen in place. The radio's static grew louder, louder than it had any right to be, carrying the voices now into a cacophony, a chorus of pain, fear, and something older, something not entirely human. My hands shook, the radio vibrating with energy that should not exist in a simple device. I dropped to my knees, the flashlight bouncing in my grip, throwing frantic light over the campsite. The voices softened just enough for me to discern words. "Leave, while you can," a single phrase repeated, layered with countless echoes of others, warning, pleading. I understood in that instant that I was at the edge of something vast, something the forest had preserved, something it wanted me to witness. I backed toward the fire, trying to rationalize, trying to ground myself in reality. Perhaps it was a trick of the static, a projection of my mind, fueled by fatigue and fear. But even as I reasoned, the air felt thick, the shadows too deliberate, the whispers too intentional. The radio lay between us, a conduit, a bridge, a reminder that the forest's memory was alive, that it could reach out through objects, through sound, through any means necessary. The night deepened. I sat again, radio pressed to my ear, flashlight illuminating the trembling edges of the camp. The voices faded slowly into intermittent static, each break a heartbeat, each pause a reminder that the forest was patient, that time was different here, stretched and manipulated, preserved for those willing to notice. I understood then that the cries were not new. They had always been here, waiting for someone to hear, waiting for someone to witness. And I had arrived. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes, though time had lost its meaning. The forest whispered, the static pulsed, and I remained, caught between the tangible and the unseen, between what was and what had been. And through it all, the voice returned one final time, soft, intimate, yet distant. Remember. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the night settle into my bones. The forest did not threaten me, not directly. It simply existed, aware, patient, its memory stretching across years, across missing hikers, across cries for help that would never find a response. And now, somehow, I was part of that memory, tethered to the forest's quiet, patient observation. I turned off the radio, letting the silence stretch around me. But the whispers lingered, faint, brushing against the edges of perception, reminding me that the forest never truly lets go. And I understood in that stillness that some calls are never answered, not because they are ignored, but because they belong to a place where time, memory, and reality fold together, leaving only the awareness that someone somewhere has listened. And I had listened. I woke to a faint glow. At first I thought it was the reflection of my own fire dying in the night, a trick of the embers casting long, unsteady shadows, but it was. The light hovered beyond the trees, flickering like a lantern swaying in an unseen hand. My stomach tightened. I hadn't heard anyone else arrive at the campsite. No footsteps, no distant voices, just the soft whisper of the wind through the branches. I rubbed my eyes, trying to make sense of it. The glow pulsed gently, brightening and dimming as if beckoning me rhythmically, intentionally. I stayed where I was, holding my flashlight, but I couldn't look away. The forest around me seemed to deepen, the shadows growing longer, thicker, more deliberate. Every movement beyond the firelight felt alive, patient, watching. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe another camper. Maybe a hiker with a lantern, lost, wandering. But the light didn't move like a person would. It floated between the trees, drifting slowly, curving around trunks, pausing at intervals as though waiting for me. And every time I thought of moving closer, my feet felt heavy, reluctant. My mind wrestled with disbelief and curiosity, the two pulling me in opposite directions. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves, the subtle creak of branches. Even the usual nocturnal sounds, the hoot of an owl, the distant scurry of an animal, were muted. The night felt compressed, held in place by something I couldn't see. And yet the light moved, flickering in the distance, a tiny pulse in the vast darkness, calling. I found myself stepping off the cot without realizing it. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam slicing a narrow path ahead, but the lantern was just beyond its reach. Each step forward felt wrong and inevitable at the same time. The forest seemed to shift as I moved, trees leaning closer, shadows stretching into strange, impossible angles. I told myself to stop, to turn back, but the light swayed again, as if it had noticed me, as if it was waiting. The closer I got, the clearer the details became. Not much, just the soft orange glow, the irregular pulse, the way the edges of it danced against the darkness. It wasn't steady like a campfire or a flashlight. It moved differently, like something alive, like it had a rhythm of its own. My mind filled with questions I didn't want answers to. Who or what was carrying that light? And why did it feel so urgent? I paused behind a cluster of pines, trying to calm my racing heart. The forest smelled damp, earthy, older than anything I'd ever walked through. Moss hung from branches in thick curtains, brushing against my shoulders as I passed. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, soft but deliberate, and I jumped, clutching my flashlight like it would protect me. The lantern swayed again, flickering slightly faster, urging me onward. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run back to the fire, to pack up and forget this forest existed. But my feet moved, almost of their own accord, carrying me closer to the glow. With each step, the shadows thickened, curling around the roots and rocks at my feet. I began to notice patterns in the underbrush, twisted branches, depressions in the soil, shapes that seemed familiar but wrong. And always, just beyond my light, the lantern flickered, guiding me deeper. The forest seemed to shift around me. Paths I was sure I had passed through before now twisted in ways that didn't make sense. Roots that had been far apart were now bunched together. Rocks that had been small became towering obstacles. I felt dizzy, like the ground itself was tilting, folding beneath me. The lantern moved as if it existed in its own plane, unbound by the normal rules of space. I told myself I was imagining it. I had to be. I stopped at a small clearing. The lantern floated there, motionless, almost expectant. I squinted, trying to see who might be holding it, but there was nothing. No hand, no figure, nothing human. Just the light, alone, and the forest breathing around it. My chest tightened. I felt as though I had crossed some invisible threshold, a line the forest had drawn long before I arrived. And on the edge of perception, I felt eyes. Not the vague feeling of being watched by animals or the wind, but deliberate, patient, unblinking eyes. The lantern flickered again, and I noticed marks on the ground around it. Not footprints, not quite, but depressions, patterns in the dirt, like someone had danced or traced symbols, long and careful. My mind recoiled. These were not natural, not random. I bent closer, trying to see, and the moment my eyes adjusted, I saw the shapes. Simple at first, circles, lines, but as I focused, they grew more intricate, twisting, impossible in design. And I felt it then, the unmistakable weight of something meant to be hidden, something meant to guide or trap. A sudden breeze whispered through the clearing. I spun, flashlight sweeping the edges. The trees swayed, but there was no wind, no movement except the leaves brushing against themselves. The lantern flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw it move toward me just slightly, like it was impatient with my hesitation. I stumbled back, heart hammering, and the glow dimmed, retreating deeper into the shadows between the trees. I swallowed, forcing my legs to move again. I followed. Every step brought the forest closer, thicker. Roots clawed at my boots, moss tugged at my shins. The lantern paused now and then, as if watching me decide whether to continue. Each pause felt like judgment. My mind spun with thoughts I didn't want. Stories of missing hikers, whispers from locals about the forest, legends I had laughed at in daylight. But now, alone, I began to understand them differently. The forest shifted again, subtly, imperceptibly, yet undeniably. I realized I could no longer see the trail I had taken, could no longer orient myself. Every tree looked alike, every shadow alike. The lantern pulsed gently in the distance, moving with a rhythm I could not follow perfectly. And with each flicker I felt the pull, not just of curiosity, but of something older, something patient, something waiting for me to cross fully into its domain. I thought I saw a figure once, a shape among the trees, fleeting, impossible to define. My flashlight trembled in my grip. I whispered to myself, trying to anchor my thoughts. It's just a lantern, it's just a light, but the glow pulsed, and with each pulse I heard whispers, not on the radio this time, but around me, behind the rustle of leaves, faint and breathy, calling my name softly, pleading. The symbols in the clearing pressed themselves into my mind, impossibly intricate. I felt as though the lantern had drawn them for me, that it existed to show me, to lead me, to test me. And then I realized with a hollow, sinking certainty that the forest had been doing this for centuries, guiding, trapping, watching. Each light, each mark, each shadow was a message, or a warning, or both. Hours seemed to pass. Minutes. I no longer knew. My eyes ached from straining in the dim light, but I could not stop following. The lantern paused, flickered, and when it moved again, I obeyed. The forest pulsed with life, patient and eternal, stretching the night into an endless expanse. And always at the edge of my perception, I felt eyes, unseen, patient and knowing. Eventually, I arrived at another small clearing. The lantern hovered there, swaying gently as if settling, waiting. I dared to approach slowly, heart hammering. The ground here was clear, but the marks, symbols, lines, spirals were denser, more deliberate. The lantern's light seemed almost sentient, brushing over the shapes, illuminating them for just a moment before retreating into shadow. I knew I was meant to see them, meant to understand them. And yet understanding felt dangerous, like seeing too much at once. I sank to my knees, chest heaving, staring at the lantern and the symbols. The forest breathed around me, patient, alive. The whispers faded, leaving only the hum of the night and the pulse of the light. I understood then that I was not the first to follow, and I would not be the last. The lantern was a guide, a test, a lure. And I was caught, a willing participant in something far older than myself. I dared to glance back the way I had come. The path was gone. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow was alive. And somewhere just beyond the reach of the lantern, I knew there were others, lost travelers perhaps, or memories preserved by the forest, waiting to become one with the night. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my trembling hands. The lantern flickered once more, and for a moment I swore it looked at me directly, intelligent, deliberate. Then it moved again, deeper into the forest, and I knew I had no choice but to follow, step by hesitant step, into whatever lay ahead. The night stretched before me, thick with shadow and memory, and the lantern, patient and unyielding, led the way. The lantern's glow had begun to fade behind me, swallowed by the thick black of the forest, but I kept moving, drawn forward by the whispering that now seemed louder, closer, more insistent. Each step sank into the damp moss beneath my boots, leaving faint impressions that I hoped would guide me back. But I already knew they wouldn't. The forest did not let you leave in the way you came. It had other plans. I stumbled into a narrow space between two ancient pines, their trunks twisted, gnarled like the hands of something old and patient. The air here was thicker, heavy with the smell of decaying leaves and soil, tinged with something sharp, metallic, almost coppery. I froze, listening. The whispers were clearer now, soft and breathy, impossible to localize. They weren't words I recognized, yet they tugged at my memory, stirring unease in a place I didn't even know existed inside me. Between the trees, the ground was littered with oddities. Small stones arranged in deliberate circles, faintly scorched wood, remnants of what looked like burnt herbs. I crouched, heart hammering, tracing the patterns with my fingertips. They were precise, careful, ancient in feel. Symbols repeated themselves, spiraling inward, and I realized with a cold jolt that they were the same shapes I had seen in the clearing with the lantern. The forest had guided me here. This was no accident. A rustle made me jerk upright. My flashlight beam swept the narrow space, catching nothing but shadows that clung to the trees like dark water. But the feeling of being watched intensified, wrapping around me, pressing down with patient inevitability. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, the simple echo of branches brushing against each other. But the whispers, they had become voices now, layered and overlapping, close enough that I could feel them brushing my skin. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. Not yet. Something kept me rooted between the two trees, something older than the forest itself. I took a shaky breath and moved forward, brushing past the trunks. The forest around me seemed to bend slightly, leaning closer, as if listening, as if expecting. Every footstep sank into the damp ground, and every crack of a twig sounded deafening in the oppressive silence. Ahead, the signs became more disturbing. Feathers, dark and matted, were arranged carefully in lines, forming paths that twisted and turned into the deeper shadows. I could see faint impressions in the soil, where something had knelt or crouched, performing tasks I could not imagine. The forest had become a cathedral of ritual, and I, unwittingly, was the intruder. I whispered to myself, trying to anchor my thoughts. It's just a ritual. People leave offerings in the woods. It's harmless. Nothing's alive here. But even as I said it, I felt the lie in my words. Something was alive. something that had seen me from the first step. I remembered the eyes I had felt in the clearing, patient, unblinking, and now I knew they were still there, waiting, watching, calculating. A sudden flicker of movement to my left made me spin. The lantern's light had returned, distant and wavering, not stationary this time. It drifted between the trunks, closer than before, pulsing like a heartbeat. And I realized with a sinking certainty that it was guiding me, deeper, further into whatever the forest intended for me. I had followed before, and it had led me to the symbols, the circles, the lines. What would come next? I took another step and the ground shifted beneath me. Not physically, but perceptually. The moss seemed darker, the shadows more defined, the space between the trees narrower, almost like the forest itself had exhaled, bending inward to enclose me. My mind resisted. My heart screamed. But the whispers drew me forward, layered now like a chorus, soft but insistent. They were urgent, almost pleading, and I couldn't help but answer them with my feet. There were bones, small, fragile, half buried among the underbrush. At first I thought they were remnants of some forest creature, but the shapes were wrong, too deliberate, too carefully placed. Someone or something had arranged them here. I swallowed hard, feeling bile rise, but I forced myself to move closer. The whispers intensified, brushing the edges of my perception, threading themselves through my thoughts. I felt drawn into the rhythm of the forest, into its patience and its secrets. The two trees I had passed between before seemed closer now, their roots forming almost a doorway. I knelt beside the symbols etched into the ground there. Circles, spirals, angular lines, all overlapping in careful repetition. I traced one with my fingers and felt the earth pulse faintly beneath my touch, subtle and rhythmic, like a heartbeat just below perception. My mind screamed that this was impossible, yet it was there, undeniable. And then I understood the whispers, not in words but in emotion. They were memories, echoes, fragments of terror preserved in the soil, the roots, the air itself. Fear, pain, desperation, echoes of past horrors that had taken place here, captured and held by the forest. The lantern's light flickered again, pulsing, and I knew it had been watching all along, guiding me to see, to understand. I wanted to leave, but there was no clear path back. The space between the trees felt like a threshold, a border I could not step away from once crossed. The forest pressed closer, bending shadows around me. I could feel the weight of countless eyes, hidden but unblinking, pressing against my back. The whispers had become voices now, layered, desperate, and pleading for recognition. They were not angry, they were patient. They were waiting. A sudden gust of wind, or something that felt like wind, rustled the branches, scattering dry leaves across the ground. The lantern swayed, flickering, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw a figure standing within its glow. It was tall, impossibly still, faceless in the dim light. I jerked my flashlight up, but the figure vanished, leaving only shadows and whispers. My hands shook. My breath came in shallow gasps. I knelt again, trying to ground myself. The earth was uneven, dotted with depressions that suggested ritual, repetition, care. My fingers traced a carved symbol, and I felt a subtle vibration, almost like a response, like the forest itself had acknowledged my touch. The whispers wrapped around me, weaving through my hair, brushing my ears, lingering like a memory. I couldn't tell if it was a warning or an invitation. Perhaps both. Time became meaningless. I was aware of nothing but the symbols, the lantern's flicker, the whispers pressing insistently into my mind. The forest was patient, unyielding. I could sense the layers of history embedded in every root, every stone, every spiraling mark etched into the earth. And I knew I was not meant to leave, at least not yet. The forest wanted me to see, to understand, to feel the weight of what had come before. Eventually I stood. The lantern drifted farther into the shadows, moving with the same slow, deliberate rhythm that had led me here. I followed, careful not to disturb the ground more than necessary, tracing the faint impressions of rituals past. The whispers followed, fading slightly as I moved, but never completely leaving. I could sense the presence behind me, patient, observing, guiding. I thought of all the stories I had laughed at in daylight, the warnings dismissed as superstition. None of them mattered now. I could feel the truth embedded in the forest itself, alive in the symbols, the whispers, the lantern's persistent glow. It had been waiting for someone to follow. And now I was here, stepping carefully between two trees, the past and the present overlapping in ways my mind struggled to contain. I stopped at a narrow clearing, where the lantern hovered over a particularly intricate arrangement of stones and ash. My flashlight illuminated the edges, but the deeper patterns remained hidden in shadow. I knelt, tracing them with trembling hands, feeling the history etched into the earth. The whispers had grown quiet here, subtle now, almost respectful, waiting for me to notice, to acknowledge, to remember. And I did. I understood in that moment that the forest did not simply consume. It preserved. It kept. It watched, patient and eternal. And the lantern was the invitation, the guide, the constant presence that ensured the memory of what had happened here would not fade, would not disappear. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my shaking body. My breath mingled with the damp air, thick and heavy. The forest remained silent, patient. The lantern pulsed faintly, beckoning me further, but I stayed where I was, caught between two trees, suspended in a moment that felt like centuries. And I knew, in a way that was deeper than fear, that I was part of something older, something patient, something that had been waiting long before I arrived and would continue long after. The whispers resumed, soft, insistent, a memory pressing against the edges of my consciousness. I followed them, step by hesitant step, deeper into the shadows, the forest guiding me, shaping me, keeping me aware of every mark, every symbol, every story that had been written into its soil. Between the two trees, I stopped once more, feeling the weight of countless eyes, the pull of memory and history, the pulse of the lantern in the distance. I knew that the forest had more to show, more to reveal, and that I would see it, if I dared to keep following. The night stretched long and patient, the lantern's light a constant, gentle pulse, leading me deeper, whispering secrets older than I could imagine. And I stepped forward, drawn into the rhythm, into the history, into the forest's patient embrace. I've always thought that the forest was honest. The trees don't lie. The wind doesn't lie. Even the animals, in their quiet, instinctive ways, tell the truth about what exists here. Or at least I had thought so, until the photographs started showing me otherwise. It began subtly. A shadow in the corner of a frame, something out of focus that I had sworn I hadn't seen with my eyes. I told myself it was nothing more than a trick of light, the way morning mist filters through pine needles. But the more I photographed, the more I noticed. Shapes, faint and blurred, just beyond clarity, standing where no one could stand. Sometimes they were tall, stretched unnaturally, like they had been pulled by the forest itself. Other times, low and crouched, limbs twisted in ways that made my stomach knot. The first time it happened, I was on the western trail near the old creek bed. I had arrived before dawn, camera slung over my shoulder, boots pressing into the cold, damp soil. The world was quiet, only the murmur of the creek breaking the stillness. I set my tripod and began snapping shots, framing the mist curling over fallen logs, the way sunlight would catch on dewdrops like scattered diamonds. When I uploaded the photos that evening, my stomach sank. On the last frame near the far edge of the creek, I saw it, something pale, almost transparent, standing between two trees. Its form was indistinct, blurred, but its eyes, if they were eyes, caught the light like twin coals in the gloom. I swore aloud, my voice shaking. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't felt anything brush past me. And yet it was there, watching, waiting. I tried to rationalize it. Long exposure, lens flare, a trick of the early light. But then the second occurrence came. I was photographing a fallen birch near the old ranger station. The day had been clear, sunlight filtering evenly, casting long shadows across the moss. I took shot after shot, framing the texture of the bark, the delicate spirals of fungus. I returned home and began scrolling through the images. And again, there it was. This time closer, its shape more defined, though still indistinct. I could see a head, perhaps a torso, but no face, just the suggestion of one in the shifting light. My fingers froze on the keyboard. I tried to convince myself it was a tree stump, a rock, an oddly shaped shadow. But something about the posture, the way it seemed to lean just slightly forward, as though peering at me through the lens, made my chest tighten. I began to notice patterns, always in the edges of the frame, never at the center, always just beyond the range of clear focus. Sometimes it appeared to shift between photos taken moments apart, as if it moved while I wasn't looking. And always it was watching. Always I felt that it knew I was seeing it, even when I thought I was. I returned to the forest the next weekend, determined to confront whatever I was photographing. The morning air was cold, sharp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. I followed the trail toward the old lookout ridge, where the canopy opened just enough to catch the rising sun. My camera hung heavy, the tripod bumping against my thigh as I moved, but I felt a strange urgency driving me forward, a need to see with my own eyes what had haunted my photos. I stopped at a clearing and raised my camera. The sunlight was perfect, falling in dappled beams across the moss. I framed a shot and pressed the shutter. Nothing, just the forest, quiet, serene. I lowered the camera, letting out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. The silence was comforting, almost deceptive. I knelt to examine a patch of ferns, turning the viewfinder from side to side, and then in the corner of my vision, a flicker. I spun, heart hammering, and the clearing was empty. No movement, no sound beyond the distant rustle of leaves. I told myself again, there's nothing here. Just trees, just light, just shadows. And yet, the sense of being watched pressed against my skin. My camera felt suddenly heavy, as if it were a conduit for something else, something I couldn't name. That evening I reviewed the day's shots. The first dozen images were harmless, ferns, moss, sunlight catching on spiderwebs. But the final 3 stopped me cold. Between 2 tree trunks near the edge of the clearing, a figure stood, hunched and elongated, almost impossibly so. Its edges shimmered with a faint blur, like heat rising off asphalt, and in the center a pair of eyes, or what my mind insisted were eyes, glimmered faintly. I pressed my fingers against the desk, jaw tight. I had not seen it. I had not felt it, and yet it was there. Sleep became difficult. Shadows in my apartment seemed to twist differently, corners too dark, reflections in glass too fleeting. My dreams were filled with the forest, the figures standing silently at the edges, watching, waiting. I began to photograph my own apartment in the faint hope that rationality would reclaim me. But the images showed only what I expected, empty corners, harmless shadows. I was alone in my own home, and yet I could feel the eyes of the forest pressing in, soft and patient, reminding me that I could leave, but it would follow. I returned once more, despite the warnings my own mind whispered. I had to know, I had to see. The trail was quiet, early morning mist curling around the tree trunks. I moved slowly, aware of every snap of twig, every shift of moss beneath my boots. My camera clicked softly with each frame, and then I saw it just briefly. Between 2 pines, a pale shape, not fully formed, not fully there, but unmistakably alive, or at least aware. It tilted its head, considering me, as if measuring something I could not name. I froze, my breath caught. The camera slipped slightly in my grip, and then it was gone as if it had never been, leaving only the memory of its presence and the echo of something that felt like intent. I knelt on the cold earth, heart racing, trying to convince myself that it was a trick, a shadow, a lapse of vision. But I knew the truth. I had seen it, and more than that, it had seen me. I left the forest that day with a heavy heart, a sense of urgency pressing at my chest. The photographs confirmed what I had felt, shapes in the dark, eyes watching, forms that did not belong to this world, or to any world I could recognize. I told myself that I would wait, that I would let the forest come to me in its own time, and yet the thought offered no comfort. I could feel the presence already, lingering in the edges of my vision. A subtle pulse of awareness that stretched beyond the trees, beyond the camera, into the very air around me. Night fell and my apartment felt impossibly small, the darkness pressing in like the forest itself. I set my camera on the table, the images glowing faintly on the screen. I studied each one, memorizing the blurred outlines, the impossible postures, the eyes that glimmered just enough to suggest thought, awareness, consciousness. The forest had shown me something I could not name, something that waited patient at the edges of perception, aware of my intrusion, aware that I had noticed. I couldn't stop photographing after that. Every day I carried the camera, scanning the woods, the edges of the city, even the shadows in my own home. And every day I found shapes, glimpses of things I could not define, eyes that followed me from places I had never walked, forms that appeared only in the frame, never in reality, and yet never purely imagined. The whispers came eventually, though I did not hear them with my ears. I felt them in the press of the air, the weight of stillness, the subtle brush of wind that seemed to guide me. Not words, not language, but intent. Something in the forest had begun to communicate, not directly, but through presence, through pressure, through the impossible shapes captured in my photographs. I have learned to live with it, though the forest calls me back. Sometimes at night, I dream of the edges of the trees, the shapes crouched in the mist waiting, and sometimes I awake to find my camera on the table turned on, a new photograph displayed, one I do not remember taking, and in it eyes, watching, patient, silent. I do not know what they are or what they want, but I know this: the forest is not honest. It hides and it waits. And when you look too closely, when you lift the camera and frame the light just right, it reveals itself in small glimpses, in shadows, in shapes that move and linger at the edge of perception. I have seen them, and they have seen me. Even now I feel it, an awareness lingering beyond sight, beyond touch, beyond reason. The forest waits, and I cannot leave it entirely. And sometimes, when the mist curls just right and the night presses close, I wonder if I ever really left it all. I remember the first time I saw the shack. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows through the thinning trees. The path leading to it was overgrown, almost hidden, as though the forest itself had tried to swallow it whole. Even from a distance, I could tell it was abandoned. Boards hung at odd angles, windows boarded or shattered, and the roof sagged under years of neglect. A chill ran down my spine, not entirely from the cold, but from a sense I couldn't name, a weight that pressed at the back of my mind. Locals had whispered about the place for years, though no one I knew had dared go near it. Stories of disappearances, of people vanishing without a trace near this part of the woods. A couple of truckers, a hiker, a family on a weekend trip. They were all said to have been last seen in the vicinity. Some claimed the shack itself held the key, as if it were the anchor for something that shouldn't exist. I didn't know whether to believe the rumors, but I was drawn there, compelled by a mix of curiosity and the need to understand what I had been photographing in the forest. I parked a few hundred meters away, letting the car engine die and listening to the sudden silence that followed. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the way it always did when I knew I wasn't alone, though I couldn't see anyone. My boots crunched along the gravel, and each step felt exaggerated in the quiet. By the time I reached the shack, the sun had almost disappeared, leaving the world in muted gray tones. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, and the air felt heavier here, thick with the smell of damp wood and something else, something faint, almost metallic, like rust or old blood. I raised my camera instinctively, photographing the exterior. Each frame seemed to accentuate the decay, the way the boards bowed and splintered, the way the trees leaned toward the building as though eager to consume it. I noticed marks in the bark nearby, scratches, circular and jagged, patterns that didn't look like anything nature had made. My stomach tightened. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but I couldn't look away. The door sagged on its hinges, moving slightly as if it had been pushed by an unseen hand. I reached out, fingers brushing the splintered wood, and I could feel the cold seep into my skin. I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and rot, a smell that clung to my clothes and hair immediately. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls, falling on a floor littered with broken glass, decaying furniture, and scattered papers. I kept my camera raised, photographing the interior with slow, deliberate frames. Every shot revealed more decay, more abandonment, but also subtle details I couldn't ignore. Faint footprints in the dust, indents in the floorboards, marks on the walls that weren't random. Some of the papers were maps, crudely drawn, showing paths through the woods with areas circled in red. Others were lists, names written in spidery handwriting, dates beside them. I held one close, heart hammering. The names were familiar. They were the missing people I had read about online whose disappearances had never been solved. I set the paper back down, hands trembling. This was more than coincidence. This shack had been used to mark something, to track something. Or perhaps something had been marking people here, long before anyone noticed. The deeper I moved inside, the colder the air became. I felt it on my neck, the brush of it, a presence just out of sight. The forest outside was silent now, the usual rustle of wind or wildlife gone. I could hear my own breathing, the faint click of the shutter on my camera, and the creak of the floor beneath my boots. Every sense screamed that I wasn't alone. In one corner I found remnants of a small fire, charred wood and ashes, long cold. Around it, tiny objects had been arranged carefully. Stones, broken dolls, twisted scraps of fabric. The pattern was deliberate, almost ritualistic. I photographed them, my hands shaking despite my efforts to remain calm. The air seemed to press against me, heavier now, oppressive, like the room itself was aware of my intrusion. I noticed the walls. Scratches deeper than before, some forming symbols that I didn't recognize, though they felt deliberate. Circles intersected with jagged lines, spirals, and markings that resembled eyes staring outward. My stomach twisted. I had seen shapes and eyes in the forest, shapes that seemed aware, watching. And here they were etched into the wood, permanent, as if someone, or something, wanted them to be seen, wanted me to notice. The whispers began then, faint and almost imperceptible. At first I thought it was the wind, sifting through cracks in the walls. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. Soft voices, low and distant, murmuring words I couldn't understand. I froze, trying to locate the source, but the sound was everywhere, inside and out, pressing against my skull. It didn't feel like human speech. It felt like the forest speaking through the shack, telling me something I wasn't meant to hear. I took another step forward, and the floor groaned under my weight. The whispers grew slightly louder, like a chorus of voices just at the edge of hearing. I raised the camera, snapping photos in rapid succession, desperate to capture evidence, desperate to confirm that I wasn't imagining this. In the viewfinder, the room looked unchanged, decayed and abandoned. But when I glanced at the display, the photos revealed movement I hadn't seen. The subtle bending of shadow, shapes curling from corner to corner, a figure crouched just out of focus. My breath quickened. I wanted to leave, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. There was something in the room with me, or at least something that had left traces so deliberate I could not ignore them. I circled the shack, photographing from every angle, every corner. My eyes kept flicking to the shadows, waiting for something to emerge, something to move. But nothing did, at least nothing I could see with certainty. Finally, I stepped back toward the doorway. I paused, glancing at the far corner. There was a coat, old and tattered, draped over a chair. It should have been unremarkable, but the way it hung, slumped unnaturally, made my skin prickle. I felt eyes on me. I know now that it wasn't human eyes. It was something else, something patient, waiting, calculating. I turned and left the shack, stepping into the cooling air of early evening. Outside, the forest seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting slightly, but the sense of being watched persisted. I glanced back at the shack. The shadows inside shifted subtly, almost as if acknowledging my presence, following me, storing my image for its own purposes. My camera clicked one last time, though I hadn't pressed it. I realized then that the shack, the forest, and whatever lingered between them were connected. The disappearances weren't random. They were part of a pattern, a deliberate record, a slow unfolding that I had stumbled into. I drove home in near silence, the car headlights cutting a narrow path through the darkening woods. Every shadow along the roadside seemed alive, bending toward me in fleeting glimpses. I avoided looking at the rearview mirror. The thought that something might have followed me chilled me, though I could not know if it had or had not. I only knew that the world felt subtly, irrevocably changed. The forest had shown me a fragment of its truth, and it was not comforting. That night I downloaded the photos to my computer and examined them. The shack's interior revealed more than I could have imagined: the marks, the symbols, the traces of people who had once been there. Some images even seemed to shimmer, as if capturing more than light and shadow. Shapes, blurred and indistinct, moved where nothing moved. Eyes appeared in places I could not explain, watching. And I realized with a shiver that these were the same kinds of eyes I had seen in the forest. Eyes that waited, aware of me, patient. I haven't returned to the shack since that day, though I know I will. There's a pull, subtle but undeniable, drawing me back, urging me to uncover more, to see further into what the forest hides. I have learned to move carefully, to respect the presence there, even if I cannot fully understand it. Every photograph is a conversation now, a record of what observes me as much as I observe it. And though the shack remains abandoned, I feel it everywhere. The forest, the edges of my vision, the silence after the wind dies. Something lingers in those broken walls, patient and waiting, cataloging, recording. I do not know what it wants, but I know this: the forest speaks through it, and if I listen too closely, if I return, I might understand. Or perhaps I might vanish, just like the others whose names were etched in paper and shadow. For now, I watch, I photograph, I document, and I wait, knowing that whatever calls from the abandoned shack, whatever lingers in the dark corners of the forest, will be patient. Time is on its side, and I am just beginning to see the truth. I can still hear them sometimes, the footsteps behind me. Even now, when I'm in my apartment with the lights on and the doors locked, I can feel the rhythm, soft and deliberate, matching my own. It began the night after the shack. I thought leaving the forest would leave the fear behind, but it didn't. Some things do not let go. That evening I drove along the same gravel path, hesitant but compelled to follow the edge of the woods. The shadows were longer than I remembered, stretching unnaturally across the road. My headlights barely cut through them. I tried to convince myself it was just the forest, the twisting branches, the way moonlight plays tricks when you're already on edge. But I knew. I had a sense, deep in my chest, that I was not alone. I parked and stepped out. The gravel crunched under my boots, and I immediately noticed the faintest impressions in the dirt. Footprints. Not mine. Small, deliberate, and fresh enough that the earth hadn't absorbed them entirely. They led along the road, stopping just at the tree line, and then continued deeper into the forest. I followed cautiously, camera ready, flashlight sweeping over the trees, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly. The forest here had a different smell than near the shack: damp moss, wet earth, but under it something else lingered. Old, metallic, faint but unmistakable. A hint of decay. Each step I took seemed amplified in the stillness. And yet ahead there were other steps, echoing mine, slower, heavier, patient. I could not see anyone, but my skin prickled, goosebumps rising along my arms. I found more signs, subtle at first: broken twigs, leaves disturbed, a small pile of stones stacked unnaturally near the base of a tree. Each sign felt deliberate, intentional, as if someone, or something, was marking me, cataloging my progress. My pulse quickened. I knew I should turn back, but the compulsion to follow, to see what was leaving these signs, overpowered the fear. The deeper I went, the colder the air became. A fog was rising now, clinging to the ground, curling around tree trunks and roots. It muffled sound and distorted shapes. I could barely see beyond a few meters, yet the footprints continued, clear against the damp earth. I began to doubt my own senses. Perhaps I had imagined them, the signs, the subtle indications of a presence behind me. But then I felt it, a brush of air, a disturbance in the fog, a shift in the sound of the leaves. Someone or something was following. I stopped, I listened. Nothing, or maybe everything. My own breathing seemed loud, ragged, uneven. And then a soft snap of a twig somewhere behind me, followed by the faintest rustle. I froze, heart hammering. Slowly, carefully, I turned. Nothing. Just fog, trees, shadows. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified, pressing into my mind as if the forest itself were alive, breathing around me. I moved again, deliberately slow, almost tiptoeing. The footprints ahead were no longer ordinary. They were paired with indentations that suggested weight, heavier than a normal person, but the pattern was human enough to be disconcerting. Each step I took seemed to be mirrored by another. I turned sharply one more time, expecting to confront someone, but the fog remained empty. The trail led me to a clearing I had not noticed before, though I had walked this path countless times. It was small, circular, with a ring of stones at the center. The ground within was darker, disturbed. I crouched to examine it. Indentations shallow, as if someone had knelt there repeatedly, leaving marks in the soil. And then among the stones I noticed scratches, deliberate, deep, forming shapes that made my stomach twist. Symbols, or perhaps letters. I couldn't tell, but they were clearly intentional. I raised the camera and photographed everything. Through the lens, the shadows seemed to stretch, bend, forming angles that did not exist in reality. I felt my hands tremble. I felt eyes, unseen, patient, cataloging my every move. I took a step back. Another sound, footsteps, softer now, circling me, never approaching, never retreating, just present. I realized then that the signs I had been following were not leading me anywhere. They were waiting. I left the clearing, moving faster now, flashlight slicing through the fog. I wanted to run, but my legs felt heavy, reluctant, as if the forest itself resisted my flight. The footsteps continued, echoing behind me, but I dared not look. Every instinct screamed at me, "Look, and it will be too late." I stumbled on roots, cursed under my breath, and forced myself to keep moving. The fog thickened, and I felt my mind strain to distinguish between sound and imagination. The forest was alive with whispers now, faint and urgent, impossible to understand. The air carried them close, brushing against my ears, and I thought I caught a word, my name perhaps, or a warning. I could not be sure. Then I saw it, another pile of stones, smaller this time, at the base of a gnarled tree. One stone had been moved slightly, as if nudged by an unseen hand. My pulse raced. The footsteps behind me slowed for a moment, and I imagined I could feel a presence breathing with me, waiting, analyzing, judging. I crouched beside the stones, photographing again. In the frame, a shadow seemed to curl along the tree, indistinct but unmistakable. When I looked up, there was nothing. I kept moving. The forest path narrowed, twisting unpredictably, branches scraping at my jacket, snagging my hair. I realized I had no sense of direction. The path I thought I had known was gone, replaced by an endless tangle of trees and fog. And still, the footsteps persisted, soft, deliberate, unrelenting. I found another marking on a tree, a deep gash, circular, as if someone had carved a symbol into the bark. My stomach tightened. I recognized it from the shack. The same shape, the same intention. Whoever or whatever had left these signs was connected to the forest, to the shack, to everything I had witnessed. And now it was connected to me. I paused, holding my breath, listening. The fog was thick now, almost suffocating. I could barely see the path ahead. The footsteps behind me seemed to slow, then accelerate, then stop again. I realized that whatever followed me was not constrained by normal rules of space or time. It could appear, disappear, or linger at will. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I reached a bend in the path and I almost tripped over something. A branch. No, it was a small, worn shoe, partially buried in mud. The kind a child might wear. I bent to examine it. The mud inside was dark, clotted but dry. The shoe was empty. My chest tightened. I could feel the eyes again, unseen, waiting, as if aware that I had discovered their token. I took a photo and moved on, faster now, though every step seemed to echo in the fog like a drumbeat following me. Hours or maybe minutes later, I found a clearing I recognized. The shack. The dilapidated building loomed through the fog, its broken windows like watching eyes. I thought I was safe, back where I had started. But the footsteps did not stop. They circled the shack, faint now, almost teasing, but undeniable. I froze, camera clutched tightly. The forest was alive with presence, patient and knowing. I dared not enter the shack again. Instead, I circled it, trying to catch any sign of movement. Shadows shifted, twisting in ways the trees themselves could not explain. The fog thickened around me, pressing close. And I realized something terrible. I was no longer following signs. The signs were following me. The forest, the shack, and whatever lingered in between had marked me. and the footsteps, soft, deliberate, inescapable, were proof. I left the forest that night with my camera full of evidence, but also with a gnawing certainty that leaving did not mean escaping. The footsteps continued in my mind, a rhythm that I could not silence. They were reminders, warnings, or perhaps invitations. I could feel them at the edge of sleep, on quiet streets, even behind closed doors. I have tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as paranoia, but deep down, I know the truth. Something is with me. And it is patient. Every photograph I examine brings it closer. Every memory of the forest reminds me that the footsteps are deliberate, slow, and aware. They are not random. They are following, always following, leaving marks, nudging objects, brushing the air in ways only I can feel. I have come to dread the quiet because that is when they are closest, circling just out of sight, waiting for me to notice. I do not know what will happen if I stop noticing. If I stop documenting, if I stop acknowledging their presence, perhaps I will vanish, like those who came before me. Perhaps I will be absorbed into the forest, catalogued and forgotten. For now, I keep moving, keep photographing, keep following the signs they leave, even if those signs are no longer guiding me anywhere. And still in the dead of night I hear them, footsteps behind, echoing mine, patient, deliberate, aware, always aware. The clearing appeared without warning, as if the forest itself had opened a door I had not noticed before. One moment I was navigating the dense fog, tracing the faint marks and footprints, and the next, the trees thinned, revealing a patch of pale earth bathed in moonlight. I hesitated at the edge, flashlight trembling in my hand, my breath visible in the cool night air. The forest seemed to lean away, holding its secrets close, while the clearing waited. It was unnervingly quiet. No leaves rustled, no insects buzzed. Even the usual hum of night critters seemed absent. The stillness was oppressive, pressing against my chest like a weight I could not lift. I stepped forward cautiously, every footstep sounding loud against the bare ground. And then I saw them. Objects arranged in deliberate patterns. The first was a small pair of shoes, darkened with mud, placed side by side on a flat stone. I recognized the type, children's shoes. My stomach twisted. Next to them, a doll, its face cracked, eyes staring blankly at the sky. The limbs were bent unnaturally, one arm pointing toward a twisted tree at the edge of the clearing. I swallowed hard. The arrangement was not random. Someone or something had organized these items. I moved closer, careful not to disturb anything. The objects increased in number as I stepped deeper. A torn notebook, its pages yellowed, lay open on the ground, letters scratched into the paper in jagged handwriting I could barely read. Words like lost, waiting, remember stared back at me. A pair of glasses, cracked lens and bent frame sat atop a rock, as if waiting for someone to pick them up. Each item felt like a token, a remnant of someone who had vanished here, their presence distilled into inanimate objects. I took out my camera and began photographing. The beam of my flashlight swept over the clearing, illuminating more details I could scarcely believe. A set of rusted tools lay arranged in a circle, handles pointing outward like the spokes of a wheel. Bits of clothing, faded and torn, were carefully folded beside them. My pulse quickened, not just from fear, but from an instinctual understanding that this clearing was a shrine or a warning. I circled the perimeter slowly. The fog from the forest edge did not fully reach here. The clearing existed in its own space, separate, defined, deliberate. I noticed more subtle signs, footprints in the soft earth, some human, some too light or too large to be ordinary. Patterns formed as I traced them, a silent language left by an unseen hand. It was meticulous, controlled, and deeply unsettling. The moonlight caught something glinting near the center of the clearing. A knife, small and old, with a darkened blade, lay balanced on a rock. I froze. My mind reeled between disbelief and horror. The knife had been placed with intention, its edge toward the sky, catching the silver light. Around it, more stones were arranged in a circle, and within the circle the dirt was disturbed. I crouched, examining it. The marks were shallow but precise, almost ritualistic. My chest tight. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. I moved slowly among the objects, photographing each. The closer I got to the center, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. I could feel a presence, not corporeal but heavy, pressing against the edges of my perception. It was as though the clearing itself were aware of me, evaluating me, judging whether I belonged or would be added to the arrangement. I paused beside a weathered suitcase, its leather cracked and fraying. The latch was broken, and inside I found old camping supplies, a small bottle of pills, and a folded letter. I unfolded it carefully. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "We saw them, they came, don't follow." My hand shook. The letter was old, perhaps decades, yet it felt recent in tone, urgent and fearful. It confirmed what I had suspected. This place had a history, one I could only begin to understand. Another step, and I nearly tripped over a small mound. I crouched, brushing away the leaves. Beneath I saw bones, small, delicate, partially buried. I swallowed, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The clearing was a repository of past horrors, a gallery of vanished lives. Each artifact, each remnant, was a testament to absence, to the people who had been here and were no longer. I wanted to turn away, but curiosity and fear tangled in equal measure. I could not leave without understanding, even if understanding would never come. I noticed the shadows now, stretching longer, moving against the light. They did not belong to any tree or object. I turned in a slow circle. The fog from the forest curled at the edges, obscuring shapes I could not name. My mind tried to rationalize, to dismiss it as tricks of light, but the sense of being watched was undeniable. The footsteps, faint now but deliberate, seemed to circle the clearing, just beyond the range of my flashlight. I could feel them, patient and observing, waiting for me to notice. There was a rhythm to the arrangement, I realized. The objects were not scattered. Each was placed with intention, creating lines, arcs, and concentric patterns. Some pointed toward the edge of the clearing, toward the forest. Others formed triangles, squares, or symbols I could not recognize. I photographed everything, trying to capture the geometry, the deliberate order. Every instinct told me to run, to flee the clearing, but I felt compelled to record it all, as though failing to do so would erase the evidence from reality itself. I paused by a tree marked with deep scratches. I recognized the pattern from the shack, from the forest edge, the same jagged, circular cuts. They were repetitions, a language I could not read, a symbol of control, of ownership. I ran my fingers along the bark, shivering at the tactile evidence of someone or something, leaving marks, claiming space, reminding me I was trespassing. The clearing was not merely a place, it was a message. I stepped back toward the center, flashlight scanning the artifacts once more. And then I heard it, soft whispers, unintelligible at first, carried on a sudden breeze. The fog shifted, curling into shapes I could barely comprehend. The whispers grew louder, insistent, though I could not understand the words. My skin prickled, hair standing on end. I turned slowly, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the clearing remained empty of living forms. The air grew colder, and I noticed the shadows stretching differently now. They seemed to pulse, in sync with the whispers. The clearing felt alive, aware of me, aware of my intrusion. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself, reminding myself that fear could exaggerate perception. But even as I reasoned, my instincts screamed. Something was here. Something that did not belong to the natural world, that had been present for far longer than I could comprehend. I circled the clearing once more, hesitant but determined to document every detail. There were more artifacts at the periphery, fragments of clothing, broken camping equipment, even a small chair, tipped over and worn by time. I noticed a faint path leading from the clearing back into the forest, narrow and overgrown, yet marked with footprints and broken branches. Whoever, or whatever, had arranged the clearing had also created a trail, a subtle invitation or perhaps a trap. I knelt by another object, a small wooden box, its lid warped but intact. Inside were trinkets, a pocket watch, a comb, a few coins. Each seemed ordinary yet out of place, imbued with the presence of absence. I could feel their weight, not physically, but in the sense of history, of time compressed into tokens. My camera clicked repeatedly, documenting the silent testimony of lives interrupted, histories erased, and secrets buried here under the indifferent moonlight. And then I noticed movement faint at the edge of the clearing, shadows shifting among the trees. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of shapes, too fleeting, too quick to discern. I held my breath. The whispers rose in volume, circling me, carried by the wind, though there was none. The clearing had changed subtly, though I could not pinpoint how. The objects seemed more deliberate, more organized, as if they had shifted while I was photographing, arranging themselves into an even clearer pattern. I stepped back, heart hammering. The realization came slowly, chillingly. The clearing was not static. It responded, adjusted, interacted. The artifacts, the shadows, the whispers, they were not merely remnants of the past. They were part of a conscious entity, patient, deliberate, and aware of me, and I was part of its observation now. I left the clearing that night with a sense of profound unease. The forest swallowed the path behind me, fog curling into the trees, erasing the trail as though I had never been there. The artifacts remained, but I knew that the memory of them lingered in the forest, in the whispers, in the rhythm of the shadows. And I carried that memory with me, heavy and insistent, like a pulse beneath my own skin. Every photograph I examined later reminded me of the clearing's presence. The artifacts, carefully arranged, seemed to shift slightly in each image, subtle changes that defied explanation. I realized then that the forest, the clearing, and whatever entity maintained it were not bound by normal rules. They existed in a space outside comprehension, and I had stumbled into it. Even now, long after I left the forest, I feel it. In the quiet of night, I imagine the clearing's artifacts, arranged perfectly, waiting, observing, responding. The shadows stretch and shift at the edge of vision. The whispers return, indistinct but insistent, as though reminding me that the clearing is never far. It exists, patient and deliberate, beyond my understanding, and it is aware of me. I do not know why I was allowed to leave that night, why the clearing did not claim me, but I know one thing: it will not forget, and I cannot forget it. I stumbled out of the forest as though the earth itself had spat me out. The fog thinned gradually, the oppressive closeness of the trees giving way to open air. My lungs burned from the running, my shoes wet with mud, leaves and twigs stuck to my jacket. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I was free. The clearing, the shadows, the whispers, all of it, remained behind me. At least, that's what I told myself. The road stretched ahead, narrow and lined with the remains of old roadside signs, peeling paint catching the faint light of the moon. I paused, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. My heartbeat pounded like a drum in my ears, drowning out everything else. But then I heard it. A whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, carried on the breeze. I froze, scanning the darkness around me. Nothing, just the trees and the road, quiet, indifferent. I told myself it was my imagination, the forest's echo lingering in my mind, playing tricks on me. I forced a laugh, harsh and uneven. "It's over," I muttered. "It's done." But the whisper came again, closer this time, more deliberate. I could not understand the words, only the tone, patient, insistent, and chilling. The sound seemed to move around me, circling, shifting with every step I took. My legs went rigid, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself, but the calm did not last. Every shadow along the roadside seemed deeper, heavier. The light of the moon fell in broken patches, creating pockets of darkness that shifted as the wind brushed through the trees. I felt eyes on me, though when I turned there was nothing. Nothing but the empty road and the rustling leaves. The whispering continued, sometimes a sigh, sometimes a breath, always around me but never in one place long enough to pinpoint. I started walking again, slower this time, my flashlight sweeping from side to side. The forest behind me receded, yet the sensation of being followed did not. Each step felt uncertain, as if the ground beneath me might give way or reach out to hold me. I passed abandoned vehicles by the roadside, old trucks left to rust, their headlights like hollow eyes staring into my soul. Something about them felt deliberate, arranged even. though I knew logically it could not be so. A cold gust brushed my face, carrying a smell I could not place: damp earth, wood smoke, and something acrid underneath, like metal and decay. I gagged slightly, my stomach tightening. It reminded me of the clearing, the artifacts, the ritualistic placement of objects that had chilled me to the bone. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the memory, but it lingered, vivid, inescapable. I kept moving, the road twisting and narrowing, each bend bringing new pockets of shadow. I thought I saw shapes in the distance, dark silhouettes that melted into the night as I approached. My mind argued they were trees, perhaps stray branches, yet my body reacted as though the shapes were aware, as though they watched and waited. Then the whisper came again, clearer now, urgent, brushing my ear like a breath. I spun, flashlight swinging wildly, but nothing was there. My own shadow leapt beside me, grotesque in its distortion, and for a fleeting moment I thought it moved independently, reaching for me. I shook violently, reminding myself it was only fear, only exhaustion, only the residue of what I had seen. I paused at a small bridge spanning a creek, the water black and sluggish below. The moonlight reflected off the surface, broken and shifting with the slight current. I leaned over the edge, peering down, and felt a shiver run up my spine. In the reflection, for a moment, I thought I saw faces staring back at me from beneath the water, small, pale faces, lips moving in whispers I could not hear. My heart slammed. I stumbled back, catching myself on the railing, trying to steady my breathing. The creek was ordinary, lifeless, but my mind refused to accept it. I forced myself to continue, moving away from the bridge, toward the distant glow of a road sign marking the outskirts of town. Each step was deliberate, slow, measured. My senses were raw, every sound amplified: the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the soft scuttle of some small animal. Yet beneath it all, the whispers persisted. They seemed woven into the very night, floating in the air, brushing against my ears, threading into my thoughts. I passed an abandoned house, half hidden by overgrown hedges. Its windows were dark, but I felt their gaze nonetheless. The whispers grew louder as I walked past, almost coaxing me to look inside. I resisted. Something about the place was familiar, a distant echo of the shack in the forest, a reminder that the horrors I had seen could exist anywhere, just out of sight. The road curved, and I finally saw lights ahead. Street lights, flickering weakly, their glow hesitant, unsure. My chest lifted slightly. Civilization, safety. I quickened my pace, feeling relief wash over me, fragile and fleeting. But even as I approached the first houses, the whispers did not abate. If anything, they seemed to follow, seeping into the shadows cast by the lamplight. I reached the first driveway and hesitated, glancing back toward the forest. The tree line was distant now, barely visible, yet the feeling of being observed remained. My shoulders tensed. I told myself I had survived, that I had left the clearing and everything beyond it behind. Yet a part of me knew the truth. Some things were not bound by distance. Some horrors lingered, patient, insistent. I arrived at a small, empty park and paused, flashlight sweeping across swings, swaying slightly in the wind. No one was there. The whispering seemed to echo from the shadows of the trees lining the playground. My stomach churned. Every instinct screamed to run, to find light, to leave the town behind entirely. But where could I go that the whispers would not follow? The night had grown long, its breath around me constant, intimate, and unrelenting. I found a bench and sat down, pressing my face into my hands. I tried to calm myself, counting breaths, forcing rational thoughts. The whispers continued, less distinct now, blending with the rustle of leaves and distant traffic, yet unmistakable. They were part of the air I breathed, part of the night itself. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to imagine the clearing, the artifacts, the faces, and the shadows remaining behind. But the whispers persisted, sneaking into my mind even in memory, in recollection, in imagination. It was as though the forest had breathed itself into me, leaving fragments behind that could not be shaken. I felt the long night pressing down, stretching out, infinite, with its breath brushing against my skin even in safety. I walked on again, toward the faint glow of streetlights marking the town proper. Each step was wary, measured, cautious. Every shadow along the roadside seemed alive, breathing softly, moving subtly. I told myself it was only fatigue, the overworked mind of someone who had witnessed the impossible. Yet I could not shake the certainty that the forest, the clearing, the whispers, they were with me still, lingering in the periphery of perception, patient and unyielding. I passed houses with lights on in windows, families inside, unaware of the forest's reach or the whispers in the night. I wanted to run to one, to knock, to tell someone, to find comfort in ordinary presence. But the fear held me back. What could I say? That shadows followed me. That whispers carried the memory of vanished lives. No one could understand, and perhaps if I spoke, I would invite them in as well. The air grew colder again, and I wrapped my jacket tighter. The road stretched endlessly ahead, though I knew it was finite. The whispers swirled around me still, indistinct now, threads in the fabric of night. I realized then that the forest, the clearing, the shadows, they had not ended. They had only changed form. They existed in memory, in perception, in the quiet moments when reality thinned and the night's long breath filled every corner. I reached my car eventually, parked by the edge of a lit street. Keys in hand, I hesitated, glancing back toward the tree line. The forest was distant now, the fog receding into memory. And yet I could feel the whispers in the spaces between light and shadow, the echoes of the clearing following me, patient and insistent. I slid into the seat and locked the doors, shaking, but the whispers continued. I could hear them even over the hum of the engine. They were a part of me now, threads woven into my mind, memories I could never erase. Driving away, I watched the tree line shrink in the rearview mirror. The road led me back to civilization, back to safety, or at least the illusion of it. But every shadow along the roadside, every flicker of moonlight through the trees, brought back the memory of the clearing, of the artifacts, of the deliberate observation I had felt. The forest had released me physically, but it had not released me mentally. I was a part of its memory now, as it was part of mine. And in the quiet of my apartment later, long after the drive, I felt it. The whispers returned even there, soft, brushing the edge of perception, present in every shadow, in every pause between breaths. They were patient, they were deliberate, and they were not finished with me. I do not know how long this will last, whether the whispers will fade or whether they will remain a constant thread through my nights. But I know this: the forest's reach does not end at the edge of its trees. It exists in memory, in shadow, in the quiet spaces of the mind. And I will carry it with me always, a patient, unrelenting presence. The night's long breath follows me, even in places that should be safe. It lingers in the silence, in the dim glow of streetlights, in every shadow. And I am no longer certain where the forest ends and I begin.